Once upon a time, in a quiet little town, there was a mysterious house that sat high on a hill. It was old and crumbling, with windows that looked like dark eyes watching anyone who dared to come close. The townspeople whispered stories about it, tales of strange happenings and eerie lights flickering in the windows at night. Some said the house was cursed, that it trapped people inside and made them live the same day over and over again. One chilly autumn evening, a group of friends decided to explore the house on a dare. They were brave and a little foolish, excited by the thrill of adventure. But as they climbed the hill, they had no idea what awaited them inside. Would they uncover the secrets of the house, or would they become part of its haunting story? As they approached the creaking door, the wind howled around them, almost as if the house was warning them to stay away. But curiosity got the better of them, and they pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with dust and shadows, and the scent of something old and forgotten filled their noses. They felt a chill run down their spines, but they stepped inside, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Once inside, they quickly realized that the house was not like any other place they had been. Each room seemed to belong to a different time. One room looked like it was from the 1800s, with faded wallpaper and a dusty chandelier. Another room was filled with strange gadgets and bright colors, as if it came from the future. The friends exchanged nervous glances, wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. As they explored, they began to notice something even stranger. The people in the rooms, some dressed in old-fashioned clothes, others in modern attire, acted as if they didn't see the teens at all. They moved about their lives, unaware of the friends watching them. It was as if these people were stuck in their own time loops, repeating the same actions over and over again. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, making the friends jump. They rushed to the source of the noise and found a room filled with broken furniture and shattered glass. In the corner stood a girl with wild hair, her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," she screamed. "You need to leave before it's too late." The friends didn't understand what she meant. They were just there to explore, to prove they were brave. But as they turned to leave, the doors slammed shut behind them. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The girl explained that the house was a time trap, a place where people lost their way and became part of its haunting. "Every choice you make here changes everything," she warned. "You have to be careful. If you don't find a way out, you might end up like us, stuck forever." The friends looked at each other, fear creeping into their hearts. They had to find a way out, but the house was vast and confusing. Each room they entered seemed to pull them deeper into its mysteries. They tried to retrace their steps, but the layout of the house shifted with every turn, making it impossible to find their way back. As they wandered, they encountered more strange people, each trapped in their own time. Some were joyful, laughing and dancing as if nothing was wrong. Others were sad, sitting alone in dark corners, their eyes filled with despair. The friends felt a growing sense of dread, as if the house was feeding off their fear. In one room, they stumbled upon a gathering of people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, celebrating a party that had long since passed. The air was filled with laughter and music, but as the friends watched, they realized the guests were oblivious to their presence. It was as if they were ghosts, reliving the same moment over and over again. The friends tried to join in, hoping it would help them blend in and escape the house's grasp. But the moment they stepped forward, the music stopped, and the guests turned to stare at them with hollow eyes. A chill ran down their spines as they realized they were not welcome. Desperate to escape, they ran through the hallways, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear whispers echoing around them, voices warning them to leave. But every door they tried was locked, and every window was barred. The house was alive, and it did not want them to go. In their frantic search, they found a dusty old mirror in one of the rooms. As they looked into it, they saw not their own reflections, but the faces of people who had been trapped in the house for years. Their eyes were filled with sadness, and they reached out as if begging for help. The friends felt a wave of sorrow wash over them, realizing the true horror of the house. In their desperation, they began to make choices. each one leading them deeper into the house's twisted reality. They took turns leading the group, but every decision seemed to pull them further apart. They could hear each other's voices, but the distance between them grew, as if the house was separating them. One by one, they began to lose hope. The girl they had met earlier appeared again, her face pale and drawn. "You have to work together," she urged. "If you don't, you'll never escape." But the friends were too scared and confused to listen. They were trapped in their own fears, and the house fed off their doubts. As the night wore on, the house shifted around them, rooms appearing and disappearing like dreams. They found themselves in a library filled with ancient books, the air thick with dust and secrets. They searched for answers, hoping to find a way out, but the words on the pages seemed to change every time they looked. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. They could hear whispers growing louder, wrapping around them like a cold embrace. The friends huddled together, their hearts racing as they tried to make sense of what was happening. They felt a presence in the room, something dark and powerful watching them. In the darkness, they heard a voice, soft and sinister. "You've come to play, haven't you?" it whispered. "But this is not a game. This is your new home." The friends shivered, knowing they were in the grip of something far more dangerous than they had imagined. Just when they thought all hope was lost, one of the friends remembered a story they had heard about the house. "We have to find the heart of the house," they said, their voice trembling. "That's where the power lies. If we can reach it, we might be able to break the curse." With renewed determination, the friends set off deeper into the house, following the faintest glimmer of light they could see in the distance. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself was trying to hold them back. They could hear the whispers growing louder, warning them to turn back, but they pressed on. Finally, they reached a grand staircase that spiraled upward, leading them to a room bathed in an eerie glow. As they entered, they found a large, ornate clock ticking loudly in the center of the room. The hands spun wildly, moving backward and forward, as if trying to escape the flow of time. In front of the clock, they saw a figure, a woman dressed in a flowing gown, her face obscured by shadows. "You've come to change your fate," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "But be warned, every choice has a consequence." The friends felt a surge of fear and hope. They had to make a choice, to confront the darkness of the house or to try to escape without facing it. They looked at one another, knowing that whatever they decided could change everything. As they deliberated, the clock began to chime, each sound resonating like a heartbeat. The woman raised her hand, and the room filled with visions of the past. People trapped in their own loops, forever repeating their mistakes. The friends felt their hearts sink as they realized the weight of their decision. With a deep breath, they stepped forward together, ready to confront the darkness. The room shifted around them, the shadows growing heavier as they faced the woman. "We choose to break the curse," they declared, their voices strong despite their fear. The woman smiled, a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness. "Then you must face your fears. Only then will you find the way out." As she spoke, the room began to swirl, and they felt themselves being pulled into a whirlwind of memories and emotions. They were thrown back into the house, each friend facing their own fears. One friend found themselves in a room filled with mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of themselves, some happy, some sad, some lost. They had to confront the choices they had made and the paths they had taken. Another friend was surrounded by the laughter of the party guests, but this time they felt the weight of their loneliness. They had to find the strength to break free from the expectations of others and embrace who they truly were. As they battled their fears, they could feel the house shaking around them. The whispers grew louder, but they stood firm, supporting each other through the darkness. They realized that they were stronger together, that their friendship was the key to breaking the curse. Just when they thought they couldn't go on, they heard the girl's voice again, urging them to remember their bond. "You are not alone," she said. "You can do this." With newfound strength, they faced the darkness head-on, their hearts united. As they overcame their fears, the house began to tremble, the walls shifting and cracking. The clock in the center of the room chimed loudly, and they knew they were close to breaking free. They reached for each other's hands, forming a circle of light in the darkness. With one final push, they shouted together, "We choose freedom." The house shook violently, and a blinding light enveloped them. They felt themselves being pulled away, the darkness fading as they were lifted from the cursed house. When the light faded, they found themselves standing outside the house on the hill, the sun rising in the distance. The air was fresh and clean, and they could hear the sounds of the town waking up. They looked at each other, relief washing over them. They had escaped, but as they turned to leave, they heard a whisper carried by the wind, a reminder of the house they had left behind. "You may have escaped, but the curse remains." The friends shivered, knowing that the house would always be there, waiting for its next visitors. As they walked away, they vowed to never forget what they had experienced. They had faced their fears and come out stronger, but the memory of the house on the hill would linger in their minds forever. And as they made their way back to town, they couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching, waiting for the next group of brave souls to enter its dark embrace. As they walked away, the sense of unease settled into their bones. A cold wind stirred, rattling the branches of the trees that lined the path. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and cornered whispers taunted them, elusive and disembodied. Suddenly, one of the friends, Sarah, stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, staring into the woods beside the path. "Did you see that?" she gasped, pointing. The others followed her gaze, but saw nothing. It was just the trees swaying, the underbrush rustling as if disturbed by something unseen. But Sarah felt it, a chill on the back of her neck, prickling with a sense of being watched. "Let's keep moving," Jack urged, but there was hesitation in his voice. The group shifted uneasily, and reluctance hung heavy in the air. They pressed on, but the feeling of the haunted house loomed over them like a storm cloud. The path twisted and turned, leading them away from the town and deeper into the woods. It was as though they had crossed an invisible line, stepping into a realm where shadows were longer and the light dimmer. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees creaked, whispering secrets that no one wanted to hear. Then, they heard it, a low, mournful wail echoing through the trees. It was a sound so alien, a mixture of sorrow and rage, that it sent shivers crawling up their spines. "What is that?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. The wail grew louder, reverberating through the air, wrapping around them like a shroud. "Come on, hurry!" Tom shouted, picking up the pace. They broke into a run, their footfalls pounding against the earth. But the path twisted even more, branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to grasp them. They slipped over roots and stumbled on uneven ground, the laughter of the house echoing in their minds, a mocking reminder of how easily they had been lured in. Just then, the chanting began. It started as a soft murmur, almost like the wind, but soon it grew into a rhythmic chant, filled with despair and longing. Words they could not understand slipped through the gaps, wrapping around them like smoke. They didn't want to listen, but they couldn't help it. It drew them in, pulling at their insides. Sarah faltered, feeling a strange urge to answer back. "What are they saying?" she murmured, almost entranced. The others pulled her along, fear outweighing curiosity. "Don't listen to it," Jack insisted, his heart racing. But the whispers slipped deeper into their minds, unsettling them in ways they could not comprehend. They finally reached a clearing, suddenly bathed in an eerie, silvery light that seemed to seep from the ground itself. In the center stood a large, ancient tree, gnarled and twisted, its bark blackened like charred wood. Beneath it lay remnants of offerings, wilted flowers, broken toys, and what looked like scraps of clothing. A chill ran down their spines as they examined the disturbing scene. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, stepping closer to the tree, drawn to it by an unseen force. The moment she did, the air grew thick with tension, as if the forest was holding its breath. The chanting intensified, swirling around them, mixing with the rustling leaves above. They felt a weight pulling at their hearts, as if the very ground beneath them mourned. Suddenly, a figure burst from the shadows, almost transparent, swaying like a candle flame. An old woman dressed in tattered white clothing, her face obscured by a veil. She laughed, a sound that was grave and chilling. "You shouldn't have come here," she hissed, her voice echoing like a death knell. "You are too late." They froze. The air thickened with dread, and in an instant, the clearing transformed. The forest blurred, flickering like an old film reel. Scenes of past gatherings, silent parties, and moments of sheer horror flashing before their eyes. Faces of those long-lost stared back at them, wide-eyed and pleading, mouths forming silent screams. "Help us! Help us!" they echoed, their voices melding into a cacophony of anguish. The friends felt their minds fraying, overwhelmed by the weight of untold stories and tragedy. The spectral old woman raised her hands, and the ground trembled beneath them, as if alive. "You've awakened them," she warned. "Now they won't let you leave." There was a sudden rush of air, like a storm, breaking. Whispers turned into cries, drowning out their thoughts. The friends felt themselves pulled backward, every step heavier than the last, as if invisible hands were grasping at them from every direction. Jack shouted for them to run, but terror had paralyzed them, each one grappling with the swelling fear of being eternally tethered to this dark place. Overhead, the sky cracked open with thunder, dark clouds swirling in ominous patterns. Lightning lit up the clearing, moments of blinding light revealing fleeting visions of lost souls, their faces twisted in pain and terror. The young friends were nothing but vessels, and they could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on them, begging for release. They were no longer standing in the clearing, but flung into a temporal vortex, a swirling storm of despair. Time unraveled around them, memories colliding, future possibilities crashing into the horrific pasts of those who had come before. Their screams melded with the voices of the damned, each trying to claim them, to keep them here forever. Fighting through the chaos, Sarah felt a flicker of strength spark within her. She grasped Jack's hand, her voice steady despite the terror. "We need to work together." With a fierce determination, she pulled them closer, urging them to focus on their bond, to remember who they were outside the shadow of the house. In that moment, or perhaps in a lifetime of moments, they locked eyes, each whispering words of encouragement, reminding each other of their lives, their hopes. They summoned every ounce of courage to stand together against the violent tide of despair. They began to chant as one, voices merging to defy the darkness. "We are not yours." A blinding light erupted, scattering the shadows like ashes carried away by the wind. The forest shook, the howling cries faltering as the ebon fog lifted, revealing the beauty of the night sky above. The old woman's scream pierced through the air, a sound of fury and anguish, fading into the distance as the oppressive weight began to dissolve. The ground beneath them surged upward, launching the friends back into the clearing, now brighter than before. They could hear the pulse of life in the air, a soft hum that vibrated against their skin. But even as they regained their footing, heavy shadows lingered at the edge of the forest, watching with hollow eyes, waiting for the chance to ensnare the next unwary souls. As the group caught their breath, they felt the bitter remnants of despair tugging at their hearts. They knew they had escaped, but the weight of what they had experienced would stay with them, a silent pact with the loss that lingered in the woods like smoke. And even as they fled through the trees, a lingering whisper threaded through the leaves. "You can run, but you will never forget." Just as they reached the boundary of the woods leading back to town, a chilling realization sank in. The house would always be watching. The price of their escape was far higher than they had ever imagined. The threads of fate had intertwined, and the house was not finished with them yet. The thought of being free was a fleeting comfort as they burst through the tree line, the familiar streets of their town just ahead. But behind them, there was no sense of safety. The feeling of being pursued clung to their backs like a shadow. The laughter of the old woman echoed faintly in the distance, and every so often, they thought they heard whispers in the wind, calling them back. With a shared, unspoken agreement, they hurried along the familiar streets, the comforting glow of street lamps casting long stretches of light that seemed inadequate against the enveloping darkness. Each friend wore a mask of fear, trying to shake off the chilling remnants of the house. "We need to talk about what just happened," Jack said, voice trembling. "We can't." "Not here," Sarah replied, glancing over her shoulder. "It's not safe." But even as they moved away, their minds raced, replaying the haunting imagery of the clearing, the faces of the lost flickering like candle flames in their memories. They walked in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them, thick and suffocating. As they neared the edge of town, they noticed strange happenings. Streetlights flickered erratically, illuminating shadows that danced around them. Windows of nearby houses appeared dark, as if something had snuffed out the light within. The air thickened with dread, almost palpable, making it hard to breathe. Tom stopped suddenly, his eyes wide. "Do you feel that?" Mia nodded, trembling. "It's like something's watching us." In that moment, a chilling gust rushed past, causing the leaves to swirl violently. Without warning, one of the lights above them shattered, glass raining down in a sharp, glittering cascade. Panic surged through the group. They instinctively huddled together, straining to hear over the sound of their pounding hearts. "Let's go to my house," Sarah suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she spoke, she knew it was a gamble. Her home had once been a safe place, but now, with the house's lingering influence, she wasn't sure if there was anywhere left that was truly safe. They ran towards Sarah's house, but the path felt longer than usual, each step echoing painfully in the dead silence of the night. Shadows seemed to stretch and grow, warped by a malevolent force. As they neared Sarah's front porch, the door creaked open slowly. A cold breeze swept through the entrance, beckoning them in like a dark invitation. "What the hell?" "I locked it," Sarah said, panic rising in her throat. "There's no one here, right?" Mia asked, glancing over her shoulder at the encroaching darkness behind them. They stepped inside hesitantly, the familiar scent of lavender and old wood an odd contrast to the terror that clung to them. The door swung shut with a resounding thud, sealing them within. They quickly checked the windows, finding them either locked or covered by heavy curtains that felt more like prison bars than a safety net. "Let's get some light," Jack said, trying to shake off the sense of dread. As he moved toward the living room, he fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The house seemed to swallow the light, leaving only the flickering remnants of their phones to guide them. "Great, just great," Tom muttered, frustration bubbling beneath his fear. "We just escaped that nightmare, and now we're stuck in another." "Stop it," Sarah snapped, her nerves frayed. "We need to stick together." Suddenly, the floor creaked above them, a heavy, deliberate sound that sent chills crawling up their spines. They froze, breaths held as they listened intently. The sound was followed by a soft thud, followed by a slow, dragging noise, as though something heavy was being pulled across the floorboards above. "What's up there?" Mia's voice trembled. "Just an old attic. Nothing to worry about," Sarah replied, though her heart raced. She wasn't so sure anymore. The dragging sound continued, accompanied by an unsettling whisper, so faint it was almost lost in the silence. They exchanged glances filled with uncertainty. "Maybe we should just leave," Tom suggested, but even as he spoke, the air grew thick with an unspeakable weight that rooted them to the spot. They were trapped, lacking the courage to move. Then, without warning, the attic door creaked open. A silhouette stood at the top of the stairs, dark and indistinct, blocking out the weak glow from the hallway. It held something in its hand, sparkles of red glinting in the dim light. Panic surged anew as the figure moved, creeping slowly down the stairs, an echo of a movement lost in time. "No!" Jack shouted. "Get back!" But it didn't stop. In fact, the slow, shuffling walk quickened, the figure hurtling down the stairs with terrifying speed. They turned to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly before them, as though reshaping itself to prevent escape. In the chaos, Sarah shouted for them to head toward the back door. "We can't stay here." They burst out of the living room, hearts racing, the floor trembling with a furious energy that felt alive. The whispers crescendoed into a chaotic symphony of sorrow and rage. As they reached the kitchen, the air thickened, pressing down on them, almost as if the house itself were a living creature, tightening its grip. Something crashed behind them, a cabinet exploding open, its contents spilling out like a frantic search for freedom. The whispers rose to a frantic chant. "What do they want?" Mia cried, fear overwhelming her. "Help us," a voice echoed, a voice layered with despair, a distortion of many who had come before them. The walls began to shudder, pictures vibrating in their frames, and the very foundation of the house felt like it was shifting. They made a desperate dash for the back door, hands outstretched in front of them. Behind them, laughter began to swell, cold and mocking, growing louder as if the house itself reveled in their terror. They reached for the doorknob, but it twisted violently, refusing to budge. "No!" Tom roared, pulling at the handle until he felt it give way under his ferocity. The door swung open, revealing the dark expanse of the backyard, a void that felt both inviting and terrifying. They barreled through the door, but the yard transformed before them, the familiar grass becoming tangled roots, pulling them back with a sinister grip. The shadows deepened, weaving around their legs, tugging them downward as though the earth wanted to consume them entirely. "Run!" Sarah screamed, tearing away from the grasping fingers of darkness that emerged from the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest as they sprinted toward the hint of streetlights in the distance. The whispers chased after them, pleading, screaming, each plea twisting into a taunt that rattled through the air. As they ran, they glanced back only to see the house had shifted, its windows now glowing with an otherworldly light, as if the very souls trapped within beckoned them to return. They heard the old woman's laughter calling them back, a seductive lull that clawed at their resolve. "Don't look back!" Jack shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They pushed themselves harder, legs burning as the weight of fear drove them onward. The boundaries of the house blurred with the shadows, not quite letting go, extending its grasp as they stumbled onto the sidewalk. In the distance, the glow of the town lights beckoned them, a promise of safety. But deep down, they knew the weight of their brushes with the spectral wasn't over. The house remained a haunting memory, and with every step they took, they could feel it festering, a dark whisper in the back of their minds, a reminder that they had barely escaped the clutches of something far more sinister than they could comprehend. They reached the edge of town, breaths heavy, hearts pounding, and the awful realization settled in. They had escaped the physical grasp of the house, but something had followed them into their safe place. It was there among the townsfolk, hidden beneath layers of familiarity, waiting patiently, biding its time to strike when they least expected it. The thin veil of their reality frayed, exposing a terrifying possibility. The house didn't just want to trap them. It wanted to be reborn through them, through every fear, every secret, every soul it had claimed before. As they glanced back one last time, shadows slithered beyond the tree line, lingering to watch, forever etched in the fabric of their lives. They pressed forward, stepping into the dimly lit streets of their small town. The familiar sights now morphed into ominous shapes, and the shadows lengthened under the street lamps, twisting into grotesque figures that flickered at the edge of their vision. Each creak of floorboards felt magnified, echoing the haunted whispers that seemed to follow them like a sinister companion. Anxiety gripped their hearts, an icy hand tightening with every step. "Why do I feel like it's closer?" Mia whispered, her eyes darting from side to side. Jack, ever the bravest among them, forced a grin, but it faltered when he met her gaze. The warmth and confidence he usually exuded melted away, replaced by a dawning realization that they no longer knew what was real. In the suffocating silence, even the rustle of leaves felt like a warning. "I'm sure it's just our imaginations," he said, though his voice shook. Ignoring the tightening knot in his stomach, he focused on putting one foot in front of the other. They passed the old cemetery, its iron gate creaking eerily as if attempting to warn them to turn back. But they didn't stop, even when the air turned frigid and the fog began to roll in, wrapping around their ankles like ghostly fingers. As they moved deeper into town, they spotted the strange flickering from the community center. No lights had been turned on, yet they could see silhouettes dancing behind the dusty windows, an unsettling celebration that echoed more like a funeral march than the joyous gatherings that usually filled the space. Faint laughter spilled out, chilling their spines, the sound warped and twisted, as if it belonged to those who no longer walked among the living. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she clutched Tom's arm. Are they celebrating something?" Tom's face twisted in confusion. "We should check it out, right? Maybe they know what's going on." He stepped toward the entrance without waiting for a response, his curiosity overwhelming his fear. The group exchanged nervous glances but followed him, driven by a mixture of dread and desperate need for answers. As they approached, the laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls in a dissonant chorus that clawed at their sanity. Pushing through the heavy doors, they entered the hall. It was empty. The lights flickered overhead, casting ugly shadows that danced along the walls, and save for the sound of their own breathing, the place felt eerily silent. The laughter abruptly cut off, leaving a void that felt palpable. "Where did everyone go?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Jack replied, his gut twisting with unease. "Maybe they're in the back." They ventured further into the building, the air thick with dust and neglect. Old cobwebs hugged the corners, and the once bright murals faded under the weight of time. Just as they reached the kitchen, the door slammed shut behind them, echoing in the stillness. A gasp left Sarah's lips as she turned, but there was no way out now. The shadows pooled around them, swirling like a dark storm about to unleash its fury. A low, throaty humming began, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. It drummed in their ears, merging with the heartbeat of the walls, resonating with something alive, something that had been waiting patiently for their arrival. "Guys, we need to get out," Tom mumbled, his eyes wide with rising panic. But as they turned back, an unnatural chill swept through the room, and the kitchen cooled by several degrees, clinging to their skin. Then came the voice, clear as day, echoing in the depths of their minds. "Stay with us," it intoned, a haunting melody layered with sorrow and seduction. It felt intrusive, probing the edges of their thoughts. Panic ignited, and they ran in all directions, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Frantically, they banged against it, feeling the wood splinter softly under their desperate attempts while the room darkened more with each dying flicker of the light. From the corner of the kitchen, shadows began to gather in the shape of figures, faces emerging, hollow and ghostly, eyes void of light. Frantically glancing around, the reality of their situation washed over them in waves of terror. "Where are we? What do you want?" Jack shouted, trying to hold onto his courage. The shadows flickered, and a hush fell over the figures, their faces terrifyingly calm, each one etched with a twisted memory. "We want to play," they whispered in unison, voices rising like a ghastly chant. With a sudden surge, the lights flared back to life, revealing an old table in the center, adorned with worn cards and a decaying game board that felt strangely alive, almost pulsating. It was as if the house had woven this place into its very essence, anchoring it in their reality. A collective shiver ran through them as they recognized the game, an unspeakable ritual, a process to bind their essence forever to the house. "What's happening?" Mia gasped, terror flooding her veins. "We have to leave. We can't stay here." But the laughter returned, a cacophonous echo that twisted around them, drowning out their thoughts. The shadows advanced, silhouetted hands reaching out, dragging them toward the table as their wills began to fade. Strong, icy fingers grasped at their wrists, pulling them closer to the infernal game. The walls began to pulse, and the room heaved with a life of its own. They tore at each other, trying to break free, but the hold of the shadows was relentless. "Help!" Sarah screamed, and for a moment, It seemed to stir the shadows, causing them to quiver momentarily as though startled. But the moment passed, the thick darkness pressing back, overwhelming them. As they fought against the inevitable, a voice broke through the cacophony, an ancient, gravelly tone. Only one can escape. Only one can break the curse. The group froze, realization hitting them with the force of a sledgehammer. The shadows stopped advancing, a morbid fascination playing across their twisted faces. "No, we can't," Tom shouted, desperation flooding his voice. They had always been a unit, a group that faced fears together. The thought of turning on one another was unthinkable. But in that moment, doubt crawled into their minds, sowing seeds of betrayal. "What if it's true?" Jack said, his voice cracking. "What if one of us could make it out?" "Stop!" Mia cried, fear seeping into her words. "We can't think like that. We need to stick together." But the eternal darkness laughed, pulling tighter at their bonds, wrapping their minds in webs of panic. The game table gleamed with an otherworldly light, and they could feel the voices pulling at their most vulnerable feelings, planting mistrust within their hearts. It was a trap, and they were caught in its deadly snare. Fingers released their grip, but only to circle back around them, now alone within the inky shadow. They huddled close, visions of betrayal swirling around them like smoke, taunting with every breath. The ancient voice wove its way through their thoughts, a soft, deadly whisper that urged one of them to turn against the others, promising freedom in exchange for sacrifice. And then, amid the chaos, Sarah's grip slipped, her resolve faltering. The shadows beckoned to her with open arms, promising that escape lay just beyond their grasp. "What if," she began, her voice trembling with uncertainty, as every ill thought spiraled deeper into her mind. Guilt washed over the group as she took a step back, an unspoken fear rising among them. Each of them felt the pull of the shadows, their hearts racing as the air grew heavier. Could one of them truly abandon their friends? From the corner of the room, the window rattled ominously, a sharp crack echoing in the silence. It felt as though whatever lay outside was watching them too, an unseen force that thrived on their fear and anxiety. The landscape beyond grew darker still, heavy clouds gathering like stormy sentinels ready to unleash chaos. "What if it could be me?" Tom murmured, his voice strained. "Maybe I can go. I can make it." "No!" Jack shouted, the words bursting forth before he could stop them. "Don't. None of us should." But doubt lingered in the air, thick like fog, suffocating reason. The shadows grew bolder, creeping forward again, their laughter almost a melody, pulling them apart while binding them together in ways none could understand. "Only the brave will find peace," the voice echoed again, each word dripping with regret and malice. "One must choose, one must sacrifice." And in that moment, the choice lay before them like a knife's edge, sharp and cruel. Would fear, betrayal, and survival rip them apart? Or could they resist the darkness that threatened to consume them all? But as the doubt swirled, they felt the walls of the kitchen begin to close in, the space shrinking around them, forcing them together, pushing the tension to unbearable heights. The pulse of the game table quickened, and the shadows loomed ever closer, their true hunger beginning to reveal itself. They knew deep down that whatever was waiting for them outside was growing in strength, and all that lay between them and freedom felt like an eternity. Would unity break the cycle, or would it lead to the ultimate choice? One that would echo in the shadows long after they were gone? With a shared glance fraught with fear and determination, they stepped closer together, all blood turned to ice, hearts pounding against the silence, defiance burning in their souls as they faced the encroaching darkness. Together, they breathed, their voices merging into a single resolve. But only the shadows responded, the horrors yet to unfold, waiting to see if their alliance would indeed be strong enough to conquer the darkness that hungered for their very souls. As the air grew thick, a menacing presence circled them like a predator ready to pounce, and they knew the real game was just beginning. The shadows pulsed with expectation, their forms quivering like dark flames. For a heartbeat, everything hung in balance, a taut string ready to snap. Each breath felt heavy, labored, as if the air itself conspired against them. They huddled close, seeking warmth, seeking strength in one another. But as they locked eyes, it became clear. They were treading on fragile ground. "Let's think," Mia whispered, her voice barely escaping her lips. "There must be a way to defeat this, whatever it is." Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she pressed her palms against the table, feeling its cold, lifeless surface under her touch. The game board seemed to move, reshaping itself subtly, as if it was aware of their fear. "It's not just a game," Jack replied, glancing at the shadows that ebbed and flowed like a dark tide. "Were the pieces?" The realization sank in, heavy like lead. Each moment felt stretched, a thickening silence filling the air, as the ghostly figures around them watched with hollow eyes, waiting patiently for their next move. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. The shadows flickered, revealing glimpses of twisted faces distorted by a grin too wide to be human. For a brief second, they could see their own fears reflected in those eyes. Guilt, anger, despair. The kitchen closed in, walls inching closer, the atmosphere thick with an unseen weight. A low whisper slithered through the air, wrapping around them. "Stay, play, embrace your fate." The voice trembled, echoing with an ancient sorrow and insatiable hunger. It grabbed each of them by the throat, squeezing tighter with each syllable. The ground beneath shifted suddenly, a violent tremor rocking the floor. Cracks spread like spiderwebs across the tiles, dark fissures yawning wide, as if the house itself was hungry. Shadows surged from the cracks, creeping towards them, each twisting tendril licking at their ankles like flame, anticipating flesh. "Move!" Tom shouted, breaking the curse of inaction, but the door remained locked, sealed by the force of the shadows. Sarah stumbled backward, her eyes full of terror. "We can't just stand here. This place, it wants us." As if on cue, the figures inched closer, their laughter now intermingled with a soft, mournful wail. The sound clawed at their sanity, drowning them in a sea of despair. They were not mere spectators. They were part of this grotesque play, and the stakes were rising with every passing second. The tension snapped like a frayed wire. Mia dashed to the window, slamming her palms against the glass, panic erupting in her veins. But the view outside had twisted into an ever-growing storm. The sky churned with roiling black clouds, twisted lightning flashing through the darkness, revealing glimpses of something far more sinister lurking beyond. Shapes moved in the corners of her vision, phantoms dancing on the edge of the storm, beckoning her with skeletal fingers. She turned away, frantically retreating back to the safety of the table, but the glowing game board drew her attention back in. It pulsated with an eerie light, as though it were alive, each square throbbing with anticipation. "Just don't look. Don't think," Jack said, eyes darting as though searching for a way out. But the shadows were relentless. They roiled and writhed, whispering promises of freedom and despair alike, their beautiful eyes wrapping around their minds like a snake ready to strike. Who are you?" Tom asked, his voice breaking under the weight of uncertainty. As the shadows thickened, a figure stepped forward, the embodiment of fear itself. Its face was a strange amalgamation of familiar features, warped into a twisted mockery of the group's shared memories, past joys twisted into grotesque apparitions. "Remember," it hissed, sweet memories turned to nightmares. The voice reverberated through their skulls, each word striking like a hammer against a nail. They were frozen in place, helpless witnesses as the visage loomed nearer, its hollow eyes drinking in their terror. They all felt it then, a deep, gnawing sense of regret, a longing for things lost. The shadows began to pull at them, tugging at their feet, reeling them back into the abyss of their own fears. Uneasy whispers swirled violently around them, echoing their darkest regrets and insecurities. Each word burrowed deeper, digging into their minds, unleashing a tide of memories better left buried. You must choose, the figure crooned, its voice a haunting lullaby. Which friend will pay the price? Don't listen, Sarah shouted desperately, clutching her head as waves of anxiety crashed over her. We have to fight it, but the shadows swarmed, drowning her words in cacophonous laughter. One by one, they felt the weight of expectation press down. The truth clawed at the edge of their minds. If one of them didn't make a choice, they might all be lost. Straighten out your cards. Let faith guide your way, a shadow murmured, gesturing to the gruesome display on the table that now pulsed under their fear. It showed twisted images of themselves, fragments of their lives twisted into surreal shapes, as if it were gleaning energy from the very essence of who they were. The game board began to rearrange itself. Pieces shifted to reveal a gaping maw at its center, gaping wide in anticipation of fresh offerings. It felt alive, hungry. An aura of dread surrounded it. And now the laughter morphed into something more sinister, a collective sigh that boomed and throbbed like a monstrous heartbeat. Decide, the shadows whispered, their breath a chill that enveloped them. One must be sacrificed. The others will be freed. The group clung to each other, but the rapture of fear overwhelmed them, the idea gnawing at their resolve. No, we can't, we won't, Jack shouted, the words falling flat against the oppressive darkness. But the shadows reinforced the pressure, each breath growing heavier, each heartbeat a staccato reminder of their mortality. Suddenly, the cacophony of voices faded and fell to a sinister quiet. Mia looked down at the game board, heart racing as she saw one piece conspicuously missing. It was her own. What does that mean? She asked, dread creeping in her voice as realization dawned. The shadows converged around her, their laughter rising to a crescendo, wrapping tighter until her heart felt like it would burst. You know what it means? They crooned in chorus. You are chosen. No, this isn't fair, she screamed, stepping back in shock, feeling the walls closing in around her like jaws of a great beast. But the voice echoed within her, wrapping around her mind like chains, insistent and cruel. Each soul has its price. Embrace your fate or seal the other's doom. She could feel the weight of their gazes, pleading yet filled with desperation, and she knew she had to choose. But at what cost? An icy hand gripped her heart, darkness wrapping around her brain like low-hanging fog. You can't let fear win, Tom said, stepping forward against the rising tide of shadows. We stand together, remember? But the murmurs escalated into screams, the cacophony roaring into a hurricane of despair, drowning them in a tidal wave of hatred, fear, and loathing. Choose! Choose! The shadows sang, their voices clawing at the edges of sanity. In that moment, Mia felt time slow, her mind spinning. She knew this was just the beginning, a terrible omen of what lay ahead. Fighting to escape the cycle they were trapped in would only lead to more suffering. They had to confront their darkest selves, or risk losing everything forever. As they stood on the brink, the shadows surged, almost palpable in their hunger, and the room spun around them, blurring the line between reality and the nightmare threatening to devour them whole. With despair tying knots in her stomach, she realized one thing with clarity. Whatever came next would change them forever. They were the game, the pieces locked in this deadly bargain with the darkness that might yet claim them all. And the question hung heavily in the air. Would they ever find their way back to the light? The clock ticked ominously. Seconds felt like hours, and each flicker of the lights reminded them that they were running out of time. The darkness was adamant and strong, but within that chilling grip, they grasped onto the thin strand of hope and defiance, a fragile thread that might just save them from the abyss. They would face the shadows together, or they would lose everything that mattered. Mia took a deep breath, her chest constricting with the weight of their situation. Fear pulsed through her veins like a living thing, urging her to run, to hide. But deep down, she knew it was too late for that. As the shadows twisted and churned around them, she could see shapes forming within their depths, reflections of their insecurities, their past sins. Something shifted in the atmosphere. a thickening presence that chilled the air and made the hair on her arms stand on end. The furniture around them seemed to vibrate with energy, every creak and groan whispering secrets of terror. The old wooden table cracked, splintering with a sound like thunder, sending shards flying in all directions. As one piece burst forth, it took the shape of a jagged talon, reaching out like the hand of a long-forgotten monster. "Get back!" she screamed, adrenaline flooding her system. She could see the terror in Jack's eyes as he stepped closer to her. "We need a plan. We can't just surrender like this." Tom's voice cut through the tension, raw and quivering. "It's feeding off our fear. We have to face it together." He extended his arm, a symbol of solidarity, but the shadows roared in defiance. They responded with a deep, guttural sound, like the growl of a waking beast, echoing around the room. With every pulse of the light, the shadows lurked closer, revealing grotesque faces that made Mia's blood run cold. "You think you can resist?" they teased, mocking laughter weaving through the air. "Your past is your prison, and it's hungry, feeding on your despair." Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the world around them warped. The kitchen twisted as though reality itself was bending. Mia felt as if she was being pulled into a vortex, the room spinning until she couldn't tell where the floor was. With a roar, the shadows erupted, swirling like a tempest, and then silence. Darkness swallowed the last remnants of light, plunging them into a void. "Where are we?" Sarah gasped, her voice trembling, reflecting the panic eating away at them. Mia glanced around, her heart thundering. They were no longer in the kitchen. They stood in an infinite hallway lined with mirrors that reflected their fear-laden faces back at them. But the glass held an unnatural quality, distorting their features into nightmarish grotesqueries. Every reflection mimicked them, yet the eyes that peered back were hollow, void of humanity. Mia reached out to touch one of the mirrors, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. As soon as she did, a scream shattered the silence. The sound felt like it was echoing from the other side, a wail of anguish that made her blood run cold. The images in the mirrors began to shift, revealing fragmented moments of their lives. Arguments, betrayals, visions of what they wished they could forget. Each scene played like an old film reel, projecting betrayal and heartache in stark relief. "No, stop it!" Jack shouted, backing away as horror gripped him. "We can't let it win." But the shadows whispered sweet promises in return, seductive and sinister, coaxing him closer to despair. Suddenly, the floor beneath them rippled like water, and the mirrors began to shatter one by one, sending glass fragments flying. Each shard dissolved into darkness, pulling pieces of Mia's sanity away, as if the shadows were consuming their reflections right before her eyes. Then, a figure materialized out of the darkness, a tall, spindly silhouette emerging like smoke. Its limbs contorted at unnatural angles, and as it stepped into the light filtering through the cracks in the mirrors, Mia's stomach dropped. The figure wore a tattered cloak made from what seemed to be strands of shadows, slithering along its form like a living creature. It held a gnarled staff topped with a pulsating orb that glowed with a sickly light, illuminating the grim expressions carved into its face. The air turned icy, every breath mixed with the stench of decay. "You wear your fears like a cloak," it hissed, voice slithering around them like smoke. How beautifully tragic. Mia's heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out her thoughts. She felt the weight of despair crushing her, a suffocating tide rising against her will. She glanced at her friends, their faces pale, eyes wide in terror, and her heart sank even lower. Gathering every ounce of courage, she stepped forward despite the paralyzing dread gripping her chest. "You're not in control," she shouted, the words cutting through the oppressive silence. "We will not let you win." As if rising to her challenge, the figure let out a low chuckle that resonated like thunder. It lifted its staff, and shadows surged forth, coiling around Mia's feet, dragging her toward the darkness. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the swirling maelstrom, a terrifying chorus of hundreds of disembodied voices joining in, echoing in a discordant symphony of their fears and anguish. In that moment, everything shifted. The ground vanished from beneath her, and she felt herself free falling into a pit of black. The sensation was so profound it felt like time itself had stopped, leaving her suspended in a void where reality twisted and morphed into an endless nightmare, infinite in both darkness and uncertainty. As she plummeted, flashes of memories shot by. Each regret, each mistake she thought she could escape, betrayals, lost dreams, the people she had wronged. The darkness warped each moment, stretching them into horrifying caricatures that twisted her insides. Face what you've done, the figure's voice echoed hauntingly, mourning yet mocking. Or lose your very selves. Mia's screams joined the chorus, filling the abyss with despair. But within that chaos, a flicker of resolve ignited in her. She remembered the bonds of friendship, the laughter, the moments of light that buoyed them against despair. With a fierce determination, she focused on that light and grasped it tightly, refusing to let it go. "I will not bow to fear," she shouted, forcing every ounce of her will into those words as she clung to the flicker of hope. "We have each other. Stand with me." It was a plea that rippled through the darkness, reaching out to her friends. They responded, voices ringing out in unison, their conviction weaving a tapestry of strength. "We fight together," they declared, defiance pulsing like a heartbeat. And then they crashed against the void, a wave of luminosity breaking apart the darkness, sending it writhing in fury. The figure recoiled as if struck, shadows peeling away like burnt paper, disintegrating into the air. For the first time, Mia felt the heaviness begin to lift, like a curtain parting to let in the light. But just as victory seemed within their grasp, the room began to tremble with an earth-shaking roar. Cracks snaked along the walls, and the air vibrated with the echoes of tortured souls. The mirrors fragmented, each shard reflecting a chaos of emotions. Mia swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. The shadows that encircled them pressed closer, and with every heartbeat, she felt the chill creep deeper into her bones. The air thickened with an oppressive dread, and it became a battle just to breathe. She glanced at her friends, their faces pale and taut with fear, and suddenly the room felt smaller, as if it was shrinking around them, closing in with a slow, sinister intent. From the corners of her vision, she caught glimpses of movement, figures slithering across the walls, melting into shapes that seemed just a shade darker than the shadows they inhabited. This wasn't mere trickery of light. It was something alive, something hungry. Dark whispers twisted through the air around them like smoke, murmuring secrets that sliced through her mind. Each word felt like ice flowing through her veins. "You're trapped. You can't escape. One must pay," they taunted, their chorus rising to a maddening pitch. Suddenly, the game board trembled beneath her hands, the pieces. Vibrating as if they had a heartbeat of their own, a low rumble echoed from the depths of the house, reverberating through the floor like the growl of some monstrous beast. The lights flickered again, plunging them into inky darkness for a moment before sputtering back to life. But when they did, Mia gasped. The game pieces had changed, morphing into grotesque caricatures of each of them. Their faces twisted in horror, bodies contorted unnaturally, and eyes wide with terror as though they were begging for release. "Look!" Jack shouted, pointing. "They're us!" The realization hit like a punch to the gut, and Sarah staggered back, nearly falling against the wall. "What does it mean? Are we really just next?" The shadows deepened, stretching towards them like skeletal fingers seeking prey, and Mia felt a spike of panic. If they truly were to be consumed, then what hope was left? As if in response, a cacophony of laughter erupted from the darkness, long and low, echoing through the room like a tolling bell. "Every game has a cost," the voice sang, sweet and sickening. "You'll pay, one way or another." Just then, the floorboards creaked ominously beneath them, vibrating with an unseen force, and the shadows began to take form around the edges like storm clouds gathering for a tempest. "Together!" Mia shouted, gripping their hands tightly. But as she looked around, she noticed Jack's face drained of color, gazing at something in the corner. She followed his gaze and saw a set of familiar figures, faintly illuminated by flickering light, standing in the doorway. It was their reflections, but distorted. They stared back, mouths stretching into wide, silent screams, their eyes pools of darkness that absorbed the feeble light, void of any humanity. With a sudden jolt, the reflections moved in sync, mimicking their gestures, but with a horrifying lag, as if they were puppets controlled by an unseen hand. "It's not just a game anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We're part of this nightmare." As they continued to watch, the reflections began to move closer, their faces morphing into familiar, yet twisted visages of guilt and regret, every confession unspoken bubbling to the surface. Then they began to smile, the twisted stretching of lips bringing a wave of nausea. One by one, the figures started to reach out, skeletal hands penetrating the boundary between the world they knew and the nightmarish realm, pulling them in, drawing nearer until Mia felt like she might scream. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, a black tide rushing to engulf them, each wave crashing against their hearts. "Run!" Tom roared, breaking the gravitational pull, and the group bolted toward the door. They stumbled across the uneven floor, hearts racing wildly, but the doorway loomed ahead. It was a mere foot away, but something pulled at them from behind. A harsh whisper stung their ears. "You can't escape. You belong to us." Just as they reached for the knob, the air thickened. An invisible force flatlined against their chests, making it impossible to breathe. Jack slammed his shoulder against the door, desperation coursing through him. "It's locked. It won't budge." Mia spun around, her eyes wide with terror, and saw the once dim figures cascading behind them. They had taken on substance, their forms now spilling out of the shadows like ink bleeding on a parchment, each one an echo of the choices they'd made in life, faces twisted in agony as they surged forward. "Face us," they screeched in a terrible union, the shrillness cutting through whatever remained of their resolve. Mia staggered back, and just as she thought she could drown in sorrow, a sudden flash of determination ignited in her chest like a flame against the dark. "We will not let fear win," she shouted, voice steady, emboldened by a spirit of defiance she didn't know she had. But as the swirling mass of darkness twisted around her, it felt less like a choice and more like a loathsome demand. The shadows pulsed forward, and suddenly the air was alive with despairing echoes of their past. Whispers of mistakes buried deep roared around her. "No," she stammered, trying to shield her friends. "This isn't real." The darkness recoiled at her words, momentarily stunned, allowing a crack of light to seep through, illuminating the depths of her soul where raw truths lay buried. It was the one thing they hadn't confronted. "Let's face this together," Tom yelled, his eyes locked onto hers, igniting the fragile spark of unity. "This darkness won't take us if we stand." There was strength in their vulnerability, and Mia felt the light swell in her chest, radiating outward as the shadows recoiled. But the figures continued their relentless assault, rallying again, feeding on their fears. From the depths, they released a spine-chilling wail that rumbled through the very foundations of the house. "You cannot escape your sins," the chorus rang out, distorting into an almost musical harmony that pulled at the edges of sanity. Something shifted within the game board. It erupted in a blinding flash, scattering pieces across the table like confetti in a storm. Amidst the chaos, Mia noticed one piece remained in its rightful spot, shining with an otherworldly glow. Her piece, the manifestation of her past and future. It was the anchor they needed. "We have to focus on this," she cried, moving toward the board despite the onslaught of memories clawing at her. As she reached for the piece, everything around them warped and twisted. The room spun violently, and they were thrown off their feet, crashing against an unseen force. A low groan emanated from the shadows as more memories spilled forth, grotesque replays of choices they regretted. Faces morphed into distorted versions, friends they'd lost, parents they'd failed, each one a knife in her gut as the darkness tried to suffocate them under the weight of guilt and despair. "No," she shouted again, determination pulsing through her veins. "We are not defined by our past." Her words hung in the air, a beacon against the encroaching night. In this moment, she realized facing the past didn't mean succumbing to it. As her fingers closed around the piece, she felt the warmth radiate through her, fighting back the chill. Jack and Sarah clung to her, grounding her resolve, and together they formed a circle around the board, shields against the chaos. The shadows shrieked in anger, swirling viciously, their tendrils lashing out as if trying to tear them asunder. "You think you're strong? You think you can win?" They seethed, voices cracking like thunder, the echoes hammering against the walls. But Mia stood her ground, heart pounding, and held the piece high. "We decide our fate," she shouted with conviction, and the light from the piece intensified, creating a barrier that pushed back against the shadows, illuminating the far corners of the room. The shadows screamed, their forms flickering, their edges peeling away like burnt paper as the light infiltrated their darkness. Waves of energy pulsed outward, and the very essence of the figures began to dissipate. For a moment, she could see the pain etched on their faces, not merely vessels of torment, but reflections of their own anguished souls lost in time. With renewed strength from her friends, she struck the piece down onto the board, and a shockwave rippled through the room, blasting the shadows back with an ear-splitting roar. "Feel your sins. Own your truths," Mia screamed, channeling every ounce of her resolve. The darkness writhed as the board lit up in a blinding inferno of glow, engulfing the entire room as the shadows reeled in agony, being ripped from the very fabric of reality. A tidal wave of memories crashed down, pushing them into the eye of the storm where they could see their past collide with the present. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, a stillness enveloping everything. As the bodies of the shadows dissolved into the ether, their wails transformed into whispers, slowly fading into echoes of peace, leaving behind a chilling silence that washed over Mia and her friends. But just then, the ground beneath them fractured. The room trembled as the faces of their past flickered before her eyes, and she knew this fight was far from over. The shadows might be retreating, but the battle had merely transformed. The remnants of fear and regret still lingered like a heavy fog, waiting, watching, ready to engulf them once again if they faltered. Outside, the storm howled, the very wind howling like a banshee, but within the confines of their resolve, perhaps there was hope yet. The silence pressed in around them, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had conspired to hold its breath. Each of them stood on the precipice of realization, hearts still racing from their narrow escape. Mia's hands trembled, still clutching the board piece that now pulsed softly in the dim light, its glow a reminder of their victory, but also of the darkness that had almost consumed them. Suddenly, the light flickered, that warm glow stuttering, as if it were fighting against the shadows still lingering in the corners of the room. A low hum began to fill the air, vibrating through the floorboards, rising in pitch until it became a grotesque cacophony of whispers. Words intertwined in a sinister melody that echoed off the walls, wrapping around them like a noose. "Help us! Save us! Let us in!" The cries escalated, a haunting refrain that slipped into their minds, sowing seeds of doubt and dread. Each voice sounded familiar yet distorted, twisted with pain and longing, a reminder of secrets long buried and guilt that refused to fade. Jack winced, pressing his hands against his ears, trying to shut out the sound, but it burrowed deep within him, twisting like a knife. I can't do this," Jack whimpered, glancing around the room as the shadows started to rise again, forming shapes that danced just beyond the periphery of their vision. The air grew heavy with an unshakable feeling of being observed, like unseen eyes watching their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Mia felt it too, the prickle of hair standing on the back of her neck. We need to keep moving. This place is still a trap. She dragged her breath in, shallow and quick, and turned back to the board. It had become more than just a game. It was a battleground of souls, alive with energy and fury. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the walls began to shift, warping and bending like a funhouse mirror. The room constricted around them, giving the sense that they were being drawn into a vortex that spun with chaotic energy. The floor beneath their feet trembled, splintered boards creaking under the weight of unseen forces. Across the room, shadows elongated and twisted into towering forms, grotesque figures looming above them, their features a jumbled mass of anguish and rage. Faces from the past, half-remembered and swirling in a confounding rage, began to appear as if summoned by their own fears. They moved closer, and with them came an overwhelming stench, decay, rot, despair. "Guys, we can't let them in?" Sarah shouted above the rising chaos, her voice barely audible over the whirling whispers that clawed at their sanity. The shadows seemed to pulsate with life, a heartbeat that matched the frantic thumping in their chests. They were no longer just fragments of memory. This was real, visceral, and desperate. Each figure reached forward, skeletal hands stretching and twisting, grasping as though to pull them into a dark abyss that shimmered only inches away. Mia stepped back, trying to remember the last words of strength they had clung to, but the warmth from the board piece began to wane, flickering like a dying star. The shadows surged forward, and the whispers turned into screams, a guttural wail that clawed at the very fabric of the room. "The cost is high. You will pay," they cried, their voices intermingling into a nightmarish symphony that resonated deep within their bones. A chilling wind howled through the cracks in the walls, a harsh reminder that they were still trapped, even as fear mounted into a crescendo that felt like a physical manifestation of their dread. Just then, behind the sinister forms, a door slammed open, splintering the darkness like a crack of lightning, revealing a long corridor that led into suffocating blackness. "Run!" Tom bellowed, shoving Mia toward the opening. They burst forward, with no time to think, adrenaline pumping through their veins as they propelled themselves down the corridor. The walls closed in around them, seemingly alive, whispering secrets of their hearts and dredging up past failures like a murky tide. With every step, shadows chased them, clawing at their heels, a relentless tide of regret and torment that felt palpable enough to cut. Humanoid shapes darted just out of sight, faces twisted in anguish, and hands reaching out as if trying to plead their case or drag them back into the swirling void of despair. Each flip of the light overhead sent fleeting shadows dancing across the walls, teasing the corners of their eyes and filling them with dread. Mia glanced back, heart in her throat at the sight of the dark forms spilling into the corridor, behind them like oil, slicks pooling on the floor, rolling and curling as it threatened to swallow them whole. But the further they ran, the less the darkness seemed to comprehend them, as if it thrived on their fear, but couldn't grasp the determination that had fueled their escape. "Stay together," she yelled, pulling Jack and Sarah closer as their feet thundered against the wooden planks. At the end of the corridor, a pulsating door emerged, pulsing with the same eerie glow as the board piece they had left behind. "Please, please let this be the way out," Mia cried, driving her shoulder against the door. It resisted at first, the edges groaning in protest, but the moment she whispered a silent plea for freedom, it swung open with an earth-shattering crack. Inside lay an obsidian room filled with shards of mirror that reflected not only their terrified faces, but also the abominations lurking in the darkness. The mirrors shimmered, rippling like water's surface, distorting their appearances beyond recognition. The floor was a reflective surface, plunging into an infinite blackness as eerily unreal as the void behind them. "Look," Sarah gasped, pointing toward one of the shards, where their own reflections stared back, distorted and unrecognizable, eyes full of dread, mouths stretched wide in silent screams, bodies twisted into grotesque poses as if trapped in a dance of death. Each mirrored image blinked in unison, and a wave of nausea washed over Mia as she fought the urge to flee back into the shadows from which they had come. "Don't look!" Jack shouted, trying to drag them away. But the reflections held them captive, each one riveted to what felt like the very core of their being. Did they see their own fears manifested? Were they destined to become those broken souls? Suddenly, the glass shard shattered, exploding outwards with a deafening crash, raining down shards that reflected not only their image but the horrors and tragedies they had run from. The cacophonous noise transformed into a low hum, a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the echoes of each moment they'd buried deep. As the echoes deepened and grew, spiraling into a deafening crescendo, images flooded the air around them. Moments of joy tinged with sorrow, love mixed with loss, each betrayal and broken promise swirling into a storm of memories, palpable and urgent. "No!" Mia screamed, stepping back into Tom, but it was too late. The mirrors hadn't merely shown them their past. They had pulled it from their minds, dragging each regret, each moment of shame into the light with a ferocity that felt both liberating and terrifying. The shimmering remnants of glass began to absorb into the walls, pulling the shadows closer, melding them with the very memories tearing at the fabric of their beings. Just as the thoughts coiled around them like serpents, a fissure opened wide beneath their feet, swallowing the ground and casting them all into the heart of their own nightmares. Mia felt the air rush past her as they plummeted into the depths below, powerless against the hungry darkness that reached up to pluck them from reality, its ravenous presence clawing at their skin. Everything that had ever haunted them, every misstep and foolish move they had made, rippled through their minds as they fell, leaving them gasping in despair. "Stay together!" Mia shouted as she grasped at hands around her, the last remnant of hope in this abyss. Just then, the air around them shimmered, and soft laughter echoed like an enchanting melody. Overcome by overwhelming sorrow, they looked down, their hearts racing as the shadows began to creep closer, echoing their own despair. "This cannot be how it ends," she thought, blood pounding in her ears as they spiraled deeper into the dark, shadows lazily wrapping around them like a blanket. Would they become yet another echo lost to the void? Or could they defy the darkness that clung to them, determined to drag them into a fate worse than death? The abyss answered. An unsettling silence enveloped them as they plunged, and one thing became horrifyingly clear. The darkness craved a sacrifice, their surrender to the past, to the weight of their own souls. But what if they refused to yield? Would the darkness recoil, or would it consume them whole? The answer hung in the air, heavy and waiting. But what if they refused to yield? Would the darkness recoil, or would it consume them whole? The swirling void beneath began to shift, pulsating with an unsettling rhythm, almost as if it were alive, hungry, aware. The sensation wrapped around them, intrusive and suffocating, pressing down on their chests, squeezing the breath from their lungs as they tumbled further into the abyss. Jack felt a sudden rush of frigid air swirl around him, chilling him to the bone. It whispered through the darkness, soft yet ominous, like 1,000 voices softly singing a dirge for lost souls. He glanced around, the others' expressions etched with terror, frozen like deer caught in headlights. "We can't stay separated," he screamed, his words swallowed by the encroaching gloom. As the silence warped into a haunting melody, dark tendrils reached out from the abyss, curling around each of them, tangible and flesh-like, the very essence of their fears materializing into something they could see and feel. Mia gasped, watching in horror as shadows emerged, morphing into nightmare apparitions that twisted and churned. "Look," Sarah pointed, her voice trembling as she gestured toward the dark mass swirling closer. Within the depths of those shadows, twisted faces of anguish stared back at them, eyes hollow and pleading, mouths wide in silent screams. Each visage was a familiar specter of sorrow, the loved ones they had lost, the friends they had betrayed, all flitting in and out of focus like flickering candle flames barely holding on to life. Then came the whispers, a disembodied chorus of accusations that filled the air, weaving through the chilling darkness like smoke. You left me. You abandoned me. The words struck like a slap to the face. Jack covered his ears, but the words sank deep, scratching at the edges of his mind, pulling at memories that he had fought to forget. I'm sorry, he shouted back at the shadows, knowing his voice was just a feeble plea in this unyielding darkness. With a sudden jolt, the ground beneath them shifted violently, fracturing and cracking open like a great maw ready to swallow them whole. The void yawned wider, and they hung precariously at its edge, the darkness beneath rumbling with the promise of nightmares if they slipped even slightly. We have to find a way out, Mia urged, the fear in her voice giving weight to her words as she struggled to keep them all together. As if responding to their desperation, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, a small glimmer through the encroaching blackness. It was just a pinprick, but it pulsed with warmth, a potential beacon of hope amidst the despair. Look, we need to get to that light, Tom yelled, leaping toward the shimmering glow. The others followed, hearts racing, drawing courage from the mere possibility of escape. But as they ran, the shadows surged forward, transforming into tendrils of darkness reaching out to ensnare them. No, get away, Sarah cried, as one of the dark hands grasped her ankle, pulling her back. She stumbled and fell, terror blossoming on her face. The shadows loomed closer, smothering her screams, their voices morphing into a cacophony of despair. You cannot escape. You belong to us. They clawed at her mind, desperate to drag her into the depths where so many had succumbed. Sarah, Jack shouted, feeling a gut-wrenching mixture of dread and determination. He lunged back toward her, but the darkness twisted and writhed, creating barriers that pushed against him, seeking to separate them further. Froze for a moment, he grabbed Mia's arm. We can't leave her. But the abyss was gnashing its teeth, hungry for every moment of hesitation. With a guttural roar, Mia grabbed Jack's hand, pulling him towards the light. We have to move. We'll lose everyone if we linger. Her voice pierced through the chaos, a beacon of resolve. Together, they raced ahead, but the gripping shadows stretched, eager to ensnare them all, murmuring in urgent tones of betrayal and despair, the chilling memories swirling furiously around their minds. Weakness will be punished, they echoed, words curling like smoke, a slow squeeze around their hearts. They shouted Sarah's name, battle cries against the darkness, but each syllable was swallowed whole, vanishing into the oppressive void. She was lost, a harbinger of doom left behind, becoming one with the twisted shadows. The taste of salt lingered in the air as fear transformed into grief, draping heavy on their shoulders. But they couldn't stop. They had to push forward, the light pulsing brighter, begging them to reach it. The shadows howled, a cacophony of anguish rising and falling like the tide just outside their consciousness. They could feel its cold breath on their necks, wrapping around them in a deathly embrace, seeking every shred of resolve. The weight of unseen eyes bore down on them from all sides, adulations of the forsaken demanding their attention. You think you can flee? They hissed, each word laced with malice. You cannot escape your fate. Tom, panic-stricken, found himself entangled in the darkness, the edges of his vision fogging over as shadows clawed toward him, pulling him into the abyss. No, Tom! Mia screamed as she watched the shadows close in, swallowing him without mercy, his anguished eyes fading into the void. The horror wrapped around her heart like a vice, squeezing until she could hardly breathe. Jack faltered, feeling the panic rising in his throat. We have to go. We can't save them, he shouted, forcing himself to move. They pushed on toward the light, its glow brighter now, illuminating the path ahead. Yet the voices grew louder, more insistent, surrounding them with a grotesque symphony of despair. Your past weighs you down. You cannot escape the life you've forsaken. You will join them. They were relentless, each taunting recollection spiraling into visions that danced before their eyes. Moments of failure, of pain, of regret, painted vividly onto the fabric of shadows that relentlessly pursued them. Mia could feel the energy draining from her with every step, the light flickering like a fragile flame in a tempest. "Keep moving. It's just ahead," she urged, feeling the shadows gripping her mind, drawing her gaze back toward the horrors of what they had left behind. Flickers of guilt stormed through her, relentless echoes of the faces she couldn't forget, the voices resonating with 1,000 regrets. Then, in a final surge of desperation, she and Jack reached the light, the intensity pushing back the darkness like a barrier. But the moment they stepped beyond that threshold, a shrill scream erupted around them, a cacophony of lost souls clamoring for release. The walls of the corridor warped and twisted, contorting as the light shattered the shadows, revealing glimpses of the horrors that lay within. The faces of those now lost, bound to the darkness, crying out for freedom. Mia gasped as the shadows struggled, writhing and pulling at the edge of the light, desperate to cling to their last remnants of hope. "We have to keep moving," Jack yelled, gripping Mia's hand, guiding her forward as echoes of their fateful choices washed over them, mingling with the radiant glow. But with each step deeper into the light, they sensed the sinister presence behind them pulling against them, clawing against the barrier that separated the living from the damned. The darkness didn't relent. It seethed with anger, and Mia could hear whispers building into a roar, encasing them in a suffocating shroud. "You will pay for their betrayal," the shadows screeched, a rush of pain and anguish cascading over them like a wave, desperate to pull them back into the folds of the abyss. "I won't go back," Mia shrieked, her voice breaking, reaching for the last vestige of hope. The light flickered erratically, threatening to extinguish with the darkness encroaching from behind, slithering forward, fierce and relentless. Mia felt the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins as they pushed forward, the light becoming a beacon against the encroaching darkness. But shadows were relentless, their cold fingers clawing at the edges of reality, reaching out toward them, seeking to drag them back into the abyss. The temperature dropped, a heavy chill settling over her like a grave blanket. She glanced back, and a sharp scream tore from her throat at the sight. Tom's face twisted in pain, locked forever in the grip of the murky depths, mouth open in an eternal cry for help. The light flickered again, and doubt crept into Mia's heart as she felt the energy wane. "Jack, keep pushing. We can't stop," she urged, looking into his eyes and seeing the flicker of panic mirrored in them. The shadows trembled with agitation, morphing into grotesque figures, their bodies twisting into unnatural shapes, whispering dark secrets that sent chills racing along her spine. A cacophony of accusations erupted. They filled the air with the tortured wails of the damned, voices revealing every sin, every regret, each one a needle pricking her conscience. "You think you deserve to escape?" they sneered, their breath like ice against her skin. "Do you think you can forget?" As they ran, the very ground beneath them began to warp, as if the earth itself was alive and hungry. With each frantic step, the surface cracked and gaped, opening like a yawning mouth trying to swallow them whole. Tendrils of darkness licked at their heels like a hungry beast, hot breath flooding over their backs as the shadows surged forward, a mass of anguish rising to consume them. "No, we have to go," Jack shouted as the void beckoned, its edges fraying and curling in on itself, creating new horrors that rose from the depths. "Cannot escape." Mia shivered, stealing a quick glance behind her as two familiar and horrifying forms began to coalesce within the swirling blackness. Sarah and Tom, their faces twisted in agony, hands outstretched, calling out for help that would never come. "Run!" Jack screamed, pulling Mia along, but the shadows were ever present, hungry and relentless, a force of nature that sought to engulf their very souls. The light dimmed as flashes of despair clawed at their resolve, memories of every moment they had let slip away flooding into their minds. The laughter of friends transformed into cries of regret, and the warmth of their presence morphed into icy fingers gripping at their throats. "You're not strong enough," The shadows mockingly murmured, their voices slithering around them as if they were constrictors tightening their coils. "You can't escape who you are." Mia stumbled, caught in a wave of self-doubt that threatened to pull her under. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out the chaotic cries and echoing shadows. A suffocating weight pressed upon her chest as she struggled to breathe. Every step forward felt heavier, as if the ground was pulling back, begging her to stay and face the darkness instead of escaping into the light. "Just hold on," Jack urged, his grip tightening around her wrist, urging her onward even as the shadows swirled around them, creeping ever closer, tasting their fear. Suddenly, the ground erupted beneath their feet, a fissure tearing through, and they were thrown apart. Mia screamed as she lost her footing, tumbling down into a chasm that opened like a grave. The darkness enveloped her instantly, wrapping her in a suffocating embrace. She flailed, trying to find something, anything, to grab onto, but the void was deep and endless, a swirling pit of despair that pulled her deeper into its reach. In the inky blackness, shadowy figures began to emerge all around her, faces twisted into expressions of torment, mouths gaping wide in soundless screams. She realized with horror that these were the souls that had been claimed by the abyss, trapped forever between regret and anguish, their lifeless eyes staring at her, hollow and lifeless. "Help us! Join us!" they whispered, their voices intertwining into a chilling symphony, each note a reminder of her own failures. Just as despair threatened to consume her, a flicker of light pierced through the darkness. Mia lunged toward it, but the shadows surged forward, pulling her back into their grasp. She could feel the icy fingers digging into her skin, dragging her closer to the abyss. "No, I won't give in," she gasped, summoning the last remnants of hope. She fought against the pull, clawing her way toward that faint light, the promise of safety. In a final, desperate surge, she grasped the light, a warm beam that ignited her senses, pushing back the shadows momentarily. "Jack!" she cried into the darkness, but her voice was swallowed by the void. Panic set in as the darkness coiled tighter around her, the shadows roaring with fury. "You've betrayed your friends," they hissed, their voices layered with malice, echoing all that she had lost. Each syllable cut like glass, leaving her gasping for air. And then the figures surrounding her began to change, shifting from the lost souls into a reflection of her own guilt, the moment she had sacrificed for her selfish desires. Each phantom whispered her transgressions, a sharp reminder of every broken promise, every friend left behind in the pursuit of something greater. "Your journey ends here, Mia," they jeered, looming closer. Their breath was chilling her soul. As the light flickered, Mia could feel its warmth slipping away, the shadows closing in again. "Fight!" a voice inside her screamed, the very essence of her being igniting with defiance. She gathered her strength, forcing herself to remember who she was, who she could still become, and with a roar, she pushed against the darkness, refusing to be consumed. The figures recoiled, howling in rage. "You cannot escape your fate. You belong to us." But the light pulsed with renewed vigor, and she felt it answering her call. She lunged forward, breaking free from the shadow's grip, back toward the warmth, the presence of hope. The abyss writhed and screamed, searching for a way to claw her back into the depths, but she was determined. "I will not be claimed by you," she shouted, and the very fabric of the shadows trembled at her resolve. Just as Mia broke through the darkness, she collided with Jack, who had also navigated the chaos. They stood together, breathing heavily, the light pulsing around them like an angry heartbeat. "We can't look back," Jack said, his voice steady but strained. "We have to move now." Together they turned toward the growing light, forcing themselves to run again. But darkness surged behind them in a wave, desperate to reclaim what it had lost. The ground continued to shift, cracks splitting further beneath their feet as the howling shadows reached out, grasping for their ankles, pulling them down with a power that threatened to rip them apart. "They're coming!" Mia cried, panic rising again as she felt the weight of despair pressing in. Darkness trailing closely behind as they sprinted toward what felt like their only chance of salvation. With one final push, they leapt toward the light, feeling it engulf them in a radiant explosion, the warmth basking over their skin, filling their souls with renewed energy. But the shadows screamed, echoing their despair, a cacophony of rage fueling the darkness that stretched into eternity. "Mia, we can't let them win!" Jack shouted, eyes wide with urgency. "Think of everyone we need to save." And suddenly, they were pushed, like a tide crashing against the storm, thrown against the tumultuous wall of darkness that separated them from freedom. The shadows writhed, a sea of lost souls, reaching out with icy fingers, grasping at their hearts, whispering lies of despair. "You will never be free," they chanted, their voices intertwining in a haunting melody. "You belong to us." At that moment, with a surge of collective strength, Mia and Jack recognized the truth. They had to confront the dark remnants of their past, raw and unflinching. They had to believe in their light and fight back against the relentless tide of sorrow, for themselves and for those they loved. And so they stood, shoulder to shoulder, and faced the shadows head-on, ready to reclaim their lives from the darkness that sought to take them forever. Through the swirling chaos, they found themselves amid echoes of laughter from happier times, memories rising to the surface, illuminating the shadows momentarily. They took a deep breath, and with unwavering resolve, they cried out together, "No more!" Suddenly, the ground shook, and the air crackled with an unnatural energy, causing the shadows to writhe violently. The whispers grew louder, drowning out their resolve, each word a jagged shard of ice slicing through the tension. As Mia and Jack clung to the warmth of the light, the shadows recoiled for a moment, and then surged forward with a ferocity that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. "Stay close!" Jack shouted, pulling Mia toward what they hoped was safety. But the shadows were relentless, creeping along the edges of the light, hungry eyes watching, eager to find weakness in their armor. With each step, Mia felt the darkness crawl over her skin like cold fingers, probing and testing her resolve. Wisps of shadow curled around her ankles like smoke, dragging at her, taunting her with visions of failure and despair. She glanced back and caught sight of a figure emerging from the darkness, a grotesque mockery of her former self, hair wild and face contorted in anguish. The form began to reach for her, its mouth moving in a silent scream that sent chills down her spine. Mia stumbled but steadied herself, forcing her feet to move. "It's trying to get inside my head," she thought, fighting against the growing fear. Jack urged her forward, but the shadows thickened, closing in with a dreadful inevitability. Mia could hear the echoes of those they'd lost whispering in the darkness, each voice laced with grief and anger. "You left us behind," they hissed, their tones slithering through the air like serpents, entwining her heart in a vice grip. "You will pay for your betrayal." The very air felt charged with an ominous weight as shadows began forming grotesque shapes around them. Twisted figures bathed in darkness started to rise, faces shifting into expressions of pain, each one a reflection of Mia's deepest fears. An indistinct chorus began to chant, growing louder with each passing moment, their voices blending into a horrifying symphony that resonated through her bones. "We are your past, your guilt, your nightmares," they sang, an otherworldly harmony that threatened to consume her sanity. "You cannot escape us. They're illusions," Jack screamed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear he felt. "Focus." But as he urged her on, the figures twisted and contorted, drawing closer until Mia could see their eyes hollow with despair. "Help us," they pleaded. "You know what you've done." The figures reached out, fingers curling, grasping, and Mia felt the chill of their touch seeping into her skin, leaving trails of ice as they grazed her. Mia felt a moment of panic rise in her throat, an urge to succumb to that chilling embrace. to lose herself in the darkness because it might be easier than fighting. But then she remembered the flickers of light, the laughter, the warmth of her friends. With every ounce of strength left in her, she shouted into the void, "No, you don't define me." The shadows recoiled momentarily as if struck by her words, but they quickly retaliated, encircling them tighter than before. The ground cracked and groaned, creating a deep chasm that stretched endlessly beneath them, the abyss beckoning with the promise of eternal rest. The whispers turned frantic, drowning out her thoughts. "Join us. Embrace us." Mia felt the pull of the darkness, a seductive whisper promising peace. Just as she teetered on the edge of surrender, Jack's voice broke through her haze. "Mia, we can't stop now. Think of everyone waiting for us." His words ignited a fire in her, piercing through the fog that threatened to consume her will. She turned to him, and the determination in his eyes fueled her resolve. Together, they pushed back against the encroaching dread. Mia felt the air electrify as their combined energy crackled against the shadows, a vibrant force pushing away the darkness. The clawing fingers withdrew just slightly, revealing a shimmering path forward. But it was clear the shadows were biding their time, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike again. With hesitant steps, they moved forward, but terror loomed over them, palpable and oppressive. Shadows coalesced into the figure of Sarah, her face marred by grief, eyes wide and pleading. "Mia," she called, her voice echoing with haunting resonance. "You left us to die. Don't you remember?" Each word was a dagger, twisting in Mia's heart, and the memories flooded back, overwhelming her with guilt. "I didn't mean to," Mia cried out, the weight of her regrets crashing down upon her like a tidal wave. "I tried to save you." But as she looked into Sarah's eyes, they darkened, and the flicker of life faded, replaced by an unsettling void. The other shadows began to swirl around Jack, who was now facing Tom, eyes hollow and filled with accusation. "How could you let her leave?" Tom's voice was laced with bitterness. "You knew what would happen. You're just as guilty." They stumbled back, trapped in a twisted nightmare where their past sins took form, ready to drag them under once more. Mia tightened her grip on Jack's hand, the warmth of his presence grounding her amidst the encroaching chaos. "We have to escape this," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. But the shadows surged again, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. The more they resisted, the more determined the shadows became, slipping through the cracks of their resolve, invading their hearts with visions of despair. Mia found herself engulfed in a storm of doubt, where every step felt like walking through molasses. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the light pulsed with fierce intensity, the warmth radiating outwards, casting beams through the darkness like spears of hope. "We can break free," Jack shouted, so full of conviction that Mia could feel it wrap around her like a shield. The shadows thrashed in response, howling with fury as the light blazed brighter. "You think you can escape?" they screeched, the voices growing louder, merging into a cacophony of despair that rumbled through the air. "You will be ours." With one last, deep breath, Mia felt the light surge within her, a powerful wave of warmth enveloping her heart. "We are not defined by our past," she shouted, her voice stronger than ever. She pulled Jack close, their courage radiating out into the darkness like a beacon. In that moment, the shadows recoiled once again, swirling wildly as if caught in a maelstrom of conflict. The ground trembled beneath them, fissuring more deeply, revealing glimpses of light from beyond the abyss as the darkness screamed in rage, unable to bear the loss of its grip on the two souls who had dared to defy it. With a burst of unity, they ran toward the light, feeling its warmth seeping into every crevice of fear within them. But even as they ran, shadowy figures lunged, grasping at them, their touch like ice. "You can't escape this," the shadows shrieked, their voices swirling around like a thunderstorm. "This is your fate." And then they were through it. The echoing darkness fell away, replaced by a blinding light that enveloped them in warmth. But they weren't safe yet. The shadows were pulling back, merging into a swirling darkness that shifted ominously, still threatening to envelop them, and still screaming out for their return. Mia and Jack felt a tug at their very souls as they stood on the precipice of light. The shadows writhed and twisted behind them, clinging to the edges like smoke creeping under a door, whispering wicked promises that you can't forget. Each breath they took felt heavier, as though the darkness was trying to pull them back, the chill wrapping around their throats like a noose. "Keep moving," Jack urged, his voice strained as he pulled Mia forward. The once warm light flickered ominously, casting elongated shadows that danced grotesquely on the ground. Every step felt uncertain, as if the ground beneath them might give way at any moment. They stumbled through the brilliant glow, but the light began to pulse erratically, casting them into a strobe effect that felt disorienting and wrong. Suddenly, that pulsing light illuminated faint, familiar figures in the periphery, friends and loved ones from their past, but they were distorted, warped in ways that made Mia's stomach churn. One figure, a friend from school, stood with a twisted smile, eyes void of humanity, beckoning her with a finger that seemed to elongate unnaturally. "Come back, Mia," it crooned, voice melodic yet dripping with malice. "We miss you." Another figure appeared beside her, ghostly and translucent, floating slightly above the ground. It was Sarah, but her face was mixed with fear and disappointment, the look in her eyes drowning in despair, a reflection of all Mia had lost. "You abandoned us," she whispered, her voice echoing, scraping against Mia's mind like fingernails on glass. "You can't escape your choices." Mia halted, the urge to step back compelling her, but Jack's hand tightened around hers, grounding her. "They're not real," he shouted, desperation lacing his words as he pulled her forward. "Don't listen to them." The shadows recoiled as if stung by the surge of their united resolve, but the figures continued to loom, growing more insistent. They reached out with hands that trailed darkness, each finger tipped with a shadowy claw, split between a curse and a plea. "Stay with us, Mia," they hissed, their voices winding around her like a vine intent on suffocating her spirit. "We can help you forget. We can make it all better." As they moved again, Mia felt a sudden cold gust of wind whip around them, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, like earth piled over a grave. She shivered, the realization clawing at her insides. This wasn't just a confrontation with memory. It was an embodiment of her guilt coming to claim her. Every choice she'd made echoed in her ears, mingling with the shadows until it was a relentless cacophony that pulsed in time with her racing heart. Then the ground beneath them began to shift, buckling and cracking, as if the earth itself was responding to the shadows' distress. They were standing on the edge of something deep and unfathomable, an abyss where nightmares coalesced. Dark tendrils reached up from the void, grasping at their ankles with desperate urgency. Mia could feel the icy fingers curling around her feet, trying to pull her down. "No!" Jack screamed, pulling her back, but she could see the doubt flickering in his eyes as the unseen forces whispered around them. The shadows bore down on them, heavier and more oppressive than before. "You belong to us. You cannot escape." In a frantic burst of adrenaline, Mia screamed back, "We're not afraid." But her voice wavered, doubt creeping in as the figures lunged closer, their features twisting into masks of anguish. They echoed with pain and anger, shattering her resolve, their cries vibrating in her chest, a haunting melody that spoke of loss and longing. "I've let you down," Mia cried, the weight of truth landing like a heavy stone. "I can't change that." The shadows paused momentarily, as if her words had struck a chord, but then laughter rang out, hollow and chilling. "Change is futile," they mocked, an eerie chorus rising and falling like a grotesque wave. "You are forever tethered to your failures." Suddenly, the ground lurched, and the breath was knocked from Mia's lungs as they stumbled. The abyss yawned wide, revealing a swirling kaleidoscope of swirling faces trapped in terror. Faces of those they loved, faces of those lost to the darkness of their choices. It was a vortex of suffering that drew the eyes, hypnotic and dreadful. "No, don't! This isn't real," she shouted, but the darker tendrils of energy snaked forward, seeping into her skin, pulling at her thoughts and memories until every one of them felt heavy with despair. She saw flickers of moments, lost friendships, choices that led to pain. And with each flicker, the shadows grew bold, creeping closer, eager to embrace her despair and drag her back. Jack gripped her hand tighter, pulling her back as the shadows swirled beneath them. And then Mia saw something that froze her heart. A shadow in the form of a child, small and fragile, eyes wide with unspoken fear. "Mia," it whispered, a soft plea tinged with chilling sadness. "Why didn't you save me?" The sight tore through her. It was the specter of her younger sibling, lost in a past she couldn't forget. The memories rushed back with blinding ferocity. Sibling fights, the moment she didn't stand up, the day she turned away from help. Her heart ached as the shadows began to close in. Each moment failed, replaying like a cruel reminder of the guilt that never left her. Mia felt the tears streak down her face, mixing with the bitter taste of regret. She tried to speak, but the words lodged in her throat, too heavy and painful to voice. The shadows coalesced around her, growing ever more monstrous, hiding her light, crushing her spirit while echoing her worthlessness. "You could have saved us, and now you will pay," they hissed with a glee that twisted the knife deeper. But amidst the whirlpool of despair, Mia felt something stir within her, a spark igniting against the encroaching cold. "I can change," she shouted defiantly, lifting her chin as she faced the shadowy figures. "I can't undo the past, but I can choose my future." With those words, she felt the light flicker within her again, urging her forward, a tender warmth rising against the chill that sought to claim her. Together, she called to Jack, and he immediately surged beside her. Their unwavering connection carved a path through the darkness. They stepped toward the abyss, not away from it, but forward, united in purpose. The shadows shrieked as they pressed closer, an enraged cacophony of tortured memories. But with every step they took toward the void, the ground shimmered where their feet met the darkness, a radiant light pushing back at the tendrils. They moved as one, a rush of energy swirling around them, lifting them above the grasping shadows. "We are not what you say we are," Mia yelled, her voice ringing with newfound strength. It echoed back, bouncing off the walls of the abyss, shifting the shadows as if her defiance were a bright force shattering chains. Yet the darkness didn't yield easily. Anger surged, and the shadows coalesced into a raging tempest, fury manifesting as a storm that pelted them with icy despair. Mia closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth of Jack's hand, the light flickering in her chest as memories of laughter and love surged to the forefront, pushing away the regret that tried to drown her. It was then she felt the fear and pain of the shadow figures piercing through the swirling despair. "They're suffering too," Jack shouted, his eyes wide as he glimpsed the truth mixed in the chaos. "They want peace." With that thought spiraling through her mind, Mia pushed forward, her voice joining Jack's as they spoke to the shadows. "We understand your pain. We're not here to abandon you. We can remember and move forward together." The shadows hesitated, a flicker of confusion breaking through their wrath, swirling chaotically between hope and dread. For fleeting moments, their forms shifted, becoming less malevolent, as if they were no longer just creatures of their anguish, but remnants of a past filled with struggle. "Do you truly wish to help us?" one shadow murmured, its voice now tinged with vulnerability. "Or are we just a reminder of your failures?" The moment hung dangerously in the air, heavy and fraught with tension, as Mia and Jack exchanged a glance filled with understanding. "We want to remember you," Mia said softly, her heart pounding, "not as shadows, but as who you were in life." An unearthly silence fell, and for the first time, Mia sensed an inkling of fear relinquished as the shadows slowed, their forms stabilizing, no longer wild and thrashing. "Remember us then," they whispered, voices intertwining like the sound of rain on metal, soft but fraught with weight. Just then, a powerful tremor rippled through the ground once more. Jack caught Mia's eye, urgency flashing in his gaze. "Now! We need to go!" The shadows reached out, clawing towards them in a desperate plea. "Don't forget us," they wailed, their voices a haunting blend of sorrow and reverberating echoes of the past, chasing after them as they sprinted toward an opening in the swirling light. With hearts pounding, they dashed forward, the surge of light growing stronger as they barreled through the brilliant barrier. But Mia felt the shadows pulse around them, the soft echoes of lost voices trailing behind. "You can't forget us." With one last push, they dove into the light, the warmth enveloping them in an embrace that felt like home, burning through the cold grasp of shadows that lashed behind them, clawing in futility. As the blinding shimmer surrounded them completely, Mia glanced back at the darkness, whispering a promise. "I will remember you." And then they were through, bursting into a radiant world that felt alive around them, each breeze carrying a sense of renewed purpose. As they emerged, the shadows faded behind, retreating into whispers, still haunting, but resolved now as something different, a reminder instead of a prison. But in the back of her mind, the chilling thought lingered. Could they truly escape their past? Or would it always be just beneath the surface, ready to rise like a tide whenever they let their guard down? As they stumbled into the light, the world around them transformed in an instant. The vibrant colors felt overly saturated, like a dream too bright to bear. An unsettling tension hung in the air, every shadow stretching longer than it should. The trees loomed above them, their gnarled branches twisting grotesquely toward the sky, as if grasping for something just out of reach. A shiver crawled up Mia's spine, and she exchanged a wary glance with Jack. The saturated colors around them faded into haunting greens and dull browns, and the once comforting warmth of the light turned cold, biting at their skin. "Did we really escape?" she muttered, doubt creeping back in. Jack didn't answer, but his grip around her hand tightened, his eyes scanning the darkening woods. "Keep moving," he urged, the unease cutting through his voice like a knife. They moved deeper into the thicket, pushing through thick underbrush that smelled of damp earth and something sweetly rotten, an odor that clawed at their senses, wrapping around them like invisible tendrils. Each step seemed to echo loudly in the silence, amplifying the crunch of leaves and twigs snapping underfoot. It felt like a sinister symphony, each note a reminder of their isolation. The air grew heavy, thickening around them as the canopy closed in. Suddenly, a soft rustle echoed from the bushes nearby, sending a jolt through Mia. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack nodded, eyes narrowing, breath held as they listened intently. All was still for a moment. Then they heard it, the faint sound of laughter, light and mocking, echoing through the trees. It danced on the wind, tugging at the edges of their minds, reminding them of carefree days long gone. "Is this a trick?" Jack breathed, taking a step back, his instincts screaming that something was horribly wrong. The laughter evolved into a cacophony, overlapping voices rising and falling like an unseen tide, growing ever nearer. The sound twisted in their ears, growing more chaotic until it morphed into screams. They weren't just echoes of joy, but echoes of anguish, reverberating with loss and desperation. Mia felt her heart race, pounding against her ribcage as the shadows stirred beneath the trees. "Run!" she shouted, adrenaline surging as she bolted forward into the depths of the woods. Jack was right beside her, feet pounding against the earth, but the laughter, now a haunting wail, followed them, closing the distance. Shadows flickered along the path, dark figures slipping just out of sight, whispering her name, taunting her with her past mistakes. Each echo sent a new wave of fear crashing over her, drowning out rational thought as she pushed deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way, dropping her into a gaping hole covered in brambles, roots clawing at her like skeletal hands. She fell into the darkness with a scream, pulling Jack down with her. They tumbled together, breathless, until they landed hard on the cold, damp ground. A sharp pain shot through her ankle as she scrambled to her feet. "Where are we?" Jack gasped, eyes wide, as he lit his flashlight, casting beams into the deep cavern around them. The light flickered to life, illuminating crude drawings on the walls, mangled faces twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for help, mouths wide in silent screams. As the light flickered, the images warped, shifting like they were alive, and the shadows within them writhing. And then they heard it, soft whispers, grating and tender, melting into the air around them. "Join us," they beckoned, sinister and sweet. "You can't escape your past." The air chilled as Mia felt a cold breath brush against her neck, raising the hairs along her arms. "They're waiting for you," the whispers echoed, filling her with dread. Shadows began to gather at the far end of the cave, swelling into dark silhouettes that shifted and rippled. "Mia," Jack's voice grew distant, fearful, as the shadows writhed closer, tendrils reaching toward them like hungry vipers. "Don't look," he shouted as he pulled her away, but Mia felt something in the shadows tugging at her, like an insatiable hunger, wanting her to remember. It was the faces, she realized, the faces from the drawings twisted in grief and despair. They were reaching out to her from the darkness, their mouths moving silently, as if trying to tell her something important, something she had forgotten. "Please," she choked out, battling to suppress the rising panic that clawed at her throat. "What do you want?" "Your guilt," the shadows howled in unison, their forms warping closer. "Embrace it. Become one with us." The very earth beneath her feet began to tremble, resonating with the cries of the long-lost souls trapped in torment. Jack was struggling to hold back his fear, his face paler than she had ever seen, eyes wide as he flashed the light desperately toward the approaching shadows. The beam flickered, illuminating the cave's horrors, faint reflections of their own faces emerging from the dark mass, twisted into expressions of despair that mirrored their worst fears. Panic surged as Mia felt the ground shifting beneath her, the shadows swirling, their cries now rising to a deafening roar. The chill in the air became a freezing grip around her heart, squeezing tighter with each passing moment, feeding off her memories. "You cannot run from your mistakes," they screamed. "You cannot hide from the truth." The shadows reached out, fingers like mist brushing her skin, pulling her closer to their anchoring void. The world around her swirled, tangling her thoughts with regret, visions flashing. Every moment she let fear get the better of her, every time she wished she could turn back time, every dream turned to dust. "Stay with me?" Jack's voice cut through the turmoil, desperation clear as he gripped her hand, but it felt like slipping sand. "We can escape this." His eyes held a flicker of hope, yet the shadows around them swelled with each passing heartbeat. As they pressed closer, their whispers became a haunting lullaby, lulling her into a false sense of safety. Suddenly, Mia saw it, the heart and core of the darkness, a swirling mass of despair and pain, pulsing like a living entity, feeding greedily off her fears and regret. "You belong here with us," it beckoned, voice low and melodic, weaving through the cacophony. Time and space distorted, and Mia struggled to grasp the reality around her, feeling the very fabric of her being wanting to fray and unravel. "Listen to me," Jack shouted, panic rising to the surface. "We can't let them take you. You have to fight." As the shadows wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, Mia's heart raced with mounting despair. "Fight," she echoed quietly, the word hanging heavy in the stale air. But how could she fight something that felt so intertwined with her own existence? The shadows curled tighter, whispering promises of peace, of finally letting go. But then, like a distant glimmer in the fog of her mind, a memory pierced the gloom, a flicker of laughter, the warmth of a shared moment. It was the brightness of her siblings' smile as they played in the sun. "No," she whispered fiercely, shaking her head, straining against the tightening grip. "This isn't how it ends." Suddenly, a sharp clarity cut through the despair. I remember you, she cried out, her voice rising above the oppressive din, and I will not forget. Mia's defiance rang through the cave, a pulse of light sparking somewhere deep within her. The shadows seemed to waver, momentarily confused, as if reassessing their hold on her. Taking a deep breath, she embraced the flicker of hope, the love, and the connection she shared with those she had lost. It filled her to the brim, washing over her like a surge of warmth against the creeping coldness. I know you're in pain, she said, feeling empowered, but I won't drown in it with you. The shadows recoiled, pulling back as her resolve illuminated the darkness. The nightmarish clawing at her heart began to ease, and the whispers morphed into a desperate plea. No, you must stay, they wailed, voices vibrating with fury and loss, but their grip faltered as she pushed forward through the pain. Together, we can remember, Mia shouted, extending her hands toward the swirling mass of shadow, determination coursing through her veins. We can heal. Just as those words escaped her lips, a wave of light burst forth from her chest, engulfing the cave and illuminating every shadowy figure within it. She felt Jack's strength beside her. Together, they embodied a radiant force that threatened to unravel the very fabric of despair around them. The darkness twisted and writhed, shrieking in anger as it fought against the brilliance. But it was no match for their unity. Mia felt the shadows disintegrate before her, their forms shimmering and fading into the ground. The weight pressing against her began to lift, and with it came a flood of names, whispers, and laughter. The memories of all who had been lost, swirling around her in a melodic embrace. Come back, came the distant wails of the fading shadows, fading gradually into nothingness, mere echoes carried away on the wind. The walls trembled as the darkness was drawn back into the abyss, leaving behind only silence. In that moment of dimming shadows, Mia felt lightness in her heart, a bittersweet ache for the lives once woven into hers. I'll carry you with me, she whispered softly into the abyss, the words hanging heavy with promise. They turned to face the cave's mouth, light flooding in, the world beyond no longer daunting but inviting. Jack's hand still held hers, and she squeezed tightly. With each step toward the opening, the remnants of despair faded into the past, their presence a whisper against the walls of her heart. They emerged into a twilight world, the colors soft and inviting. And for the first time since their journey began, she felt as though they might finally be free. But as the edge of the forest grew near, a sliver of doubt carved its way into her thoughts, a chilling whisper carried on the wind. As the last remnants of shadows faded behind, another darkness began to stir, a more sinister whisper, lurking in the depths of her own heart, waiting for the moment she might falter. Will you truly remember? It taunted, echoing in the recesses of her mind. Or will you simply bury it all again? Every time she doubted, it threatened to return, clawing at the edges of her resolve. Mia felt her pulse quicken as they reached the end of the path. What if the shadows came back, more potent and desperate, more powerful than before? And soon, an unsettling thought struck her. What if, in their attempt to escape their guilt, they had awakened something darker in the forest? Pushing those thoughts aside, they stepped into a clearing bathed in moonlight, a space untouched by the shadows they had just conquered. Yet, at the center of the clearing lay an eerie stone altar, etched with ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with life. The air shifted around it, thick and heavy, whispering secrets from the past that suddenly felt out of reach. Do you hear that? Jack's voice trembled slightly. It sounds like... But before he could finish, a chill swept through the clearing, pulling back the darkness they thought they had left behind. The wind howled suddenly, carrying with it the distant echoes of laughter and cries. It was the torment of souls long forgotten, beckoning them closer to the altar, enticing them with the promise of answers that felt dangerous. Mia stepped cautiously forward, drawn in by a force she didn't quite understand. Shadows flickered at the edges of the altar, swirling and twisting, creating shapes that danced and whispered her name once more. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with sorrowful eyes and lips curled in a knowing smile. "You have returned," she announced, her voice smooth yet haunting. "You are the key to our liberation." "Liberation?" Jack echoed, confusion spilling into his words as Mia felt her heart race. Each word the woman spoke, pulling her deeper into the shadowy abyss of her fears. "Yes," she said, beckoning them closer with a wave of her hand, the shadows swirling more densely around her. "You must accept your fate. You can lead them to freedom. To save many, you must confront your darkest memories." The weight of those words sank deep into Mia's chest, binding her there. What was it going to take for them to be truly free? She wore her worries openly, the burden of her past lingering heavy. But in that moment, curiosity sparked within her, a flicker of defiance fighting against the fear. "What must we do?" Mia demanded, stepping closer, the urge to discover more overpowering. The woman smiled, a flash of teeth in the moonlight, and began to guide them around the altar, weaving tales of lost souls and choices made in fear. "You must confront the demons you harbor," she explained, her voice a melody that twisted around their minds like ivy, wrapping tighter with each word. As she spoke, shadows danced along the ground, distorting the shapes of trees that loomed tall around them, their elongated fingers stretching toward the altar, as if the very forest wanted to pull them back into its embrace. Mia's heart raced, a primal instinct screaming for her to flee. Yet, there was no turning back now. She could feel the pull of the altar, an almost magnetic force guiding her closer even as dread seeped into her bones. Jack glanced at her, his eyes wide, a silent plea begging her to resist. But the woman continued, her voice dripping with an unsettling sweetness that wrapped around them like a shroud. "Here lies the truth of your suffering, the weight of your regrets," she said, gesturing toward the symbols etched into the stone. The carvings began to shift and ripple, glowing faintly in the dim light, revealing haunting images of people, those Mia had lost in moments she wished she could erase. They twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their faces contorting in pain. "Each symbol holds a story," the woman murmured, her gaze piercing through Mia and Jack. "A story you must own if you desire peace. But be warned, facing your truth is not without its price." Suddenly, the ground beneath them rumbled, and a low groan echoed from the depths of the earth, vibrating through the altar. The air thickened as a dense fog rolled in, swirling around their ankles, blocking out the moonlight. A familiarity pulsed in the darkness, a sense of all that had been lost creeping back into Mia's awareness, pulling her further into the fog. "What happens if we don't face it?" Jack asked, fear lacing his voice as he stepped back slightly, pressing into Mia's side. But before the woman could answer, the fog coiled around them, snaking its way up to his knees, then to his waist, twining around them like clutching fingers. Mia's breath hitched in her throat as she realized she could hear whispers in the mist, frantic voices urging her to listen, to remember. "Jack, do you hear that?" she said, her own voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, pulling tighter around them, creating a backdrop of chaos, threads of memories long kept buried surfacing amidst the fog. "Don't! We need to get away from here," Jack shouted, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the eerie sounds. But Mia felt drawn to them. Each whisper pulled her closer to the altar, forming images in her mind. Her mother's gentle touch, her brother's laughter, then a darker memory, one of loss and regret that felt too fresh despite the years that had passed. "Stay with us," an echoing voice pleaded, thick and syrupy, weaving through her thoughts like a spider wrapping its prey. An image flashed, a haunting figure cloaked in shadows, eyes hollow, extending a twisted hand toward her, beckoning. Mia felt her pulse quicken again, panic tightening in her chest as she tried to shake it off. "You must choose," the woman said sharply, her tone shifting, energy crackling around her. Mia squeezed Jack's hand, feeling his warmth as if it were a lifeline, but the fog thickened, seeming to animate the memory itself. a night wrapped in fear, the storm that took it all away. The shadows around them elongated, twisting into figures, flickering forms of her past, their haunted faces staring out at her, twisted in resentment and pain. "You let us go. You left us there," they jeered, their words colliding with the haunting laughter that echoed through the clearing. She clamped her eyes shut, but images sprouted behind her eyelids, her family reaching out, pleading with her in a whirlwind of chaos, faces stretched and distorted in terrifying anguish. The realization crashed over her that she had deep, hidden fears festering inside, fears that should have remained buried but were clawing their way to the surface. Briar patch roots tangled around her heart, pulling tight, reminding her of moments lost in time where she had been all too afraid to step forward, to say goodbye. "We're here," Jack snapped, shaking her gently, pulling her back from the edge of that darkness. But the whispers intensified, shrill and desperate. "Join us," they cried, voices melding into a monstrous chorus, a deafening symphony of despair engulfing her thoughts. A shadow lunged out, wrapping itself around her ankles, dragging her down slowly into the depths of grief and sorrow. "No!" Mia screamed, pulling back as panic flooded through her body. "I will not let you take me." She could feel her heartbeat thundering in her ears, could sense her resolve wavering as she grappled with the shadows clawing at her past. Jack tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her back from the edge of that precipice, but she felt it slipping, the terror rising in her chest like bile. Suddenly, with renewed determination, she turned her gaze toward the woman. "What do we need to do?" she demanded, voice firm, cutting through the chaos with clarity. "I will face my fears, but I won't do it alone." Jack stood resolute beside her, the heat of courage mingling with fear as they faced the swirling fog together. Together, the woman smiled, her eyes alight with something enigmatic, as if the hope within their hearts strengthened the light against the gathering gloom. She gestured toward the altar. "You must shed your burdens. Write your regrets in the sand. Speak their names aloud, and face the anguish you've tried to outrun." The ground trembled below them, an ominous growl echoing back through the trees. Shadows flickered, and Mia realized that all along, they had been a part of this story, cocooned in their fears, bound by the secrets they dared not share. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the altar with Jack beside her, their hearts pounding in sync like a war drum. Mia knelt down, pressing her palms into the sandy earth. The texture felt rough beneath her fingers, grounding her as she began to scribble hastily, each name a weight lifted. As she wrote, the names shattered the fog around them, creating waves of energy that rippled outward. With each name, the whispers in the shadows grew louder, transforming from taunts into mournful wails. "You can't leave us," they cried, the ground vibrating beneath their feet. "You're part of our suffering." She could feel the shadows coiling tighter, their anger palpable, thickening the atmosphere, but Mia focused on the warmth rising from her heart, drawing strength from it. "No," she shouted, "I will not let you drown me in my past." Jack joined her, riding alongside her, their fears merging in the sand, creating a tapestry of grief. The darkness lunged at them, shadows dripping like ink, but Mia stood firm, determined to break free. "We are here! We remember!" they shouted together, their voices mingling, a powerful chant against the encroaching despair. In that moment, light burst from the altar, illuminating the clearing, the fog shattering like glass. The shadows screeched, retreating into the corners of the forest, their forms twisting violently as the warmth from their shared courage pushed back against the darkness. The cries faded into mere echoes, but the promise of their pain lingered in the air, heavy and raw, as if it had shaped the night itself. As the last remnants of the fog peeled away, Mia felt a rippling sensation in her chest, both a closure and an opening. New whispers began to drift through the air, softer now, tinged with understanding rather than torment. "You are not alone. We forgive," they murmured, weaving through the space like a comforting balm. Each word lightened the weight on her heart, each essence of forgiveness breaking the cycle of despair. But as they stepped back from the altar, a new darkness began to form, creeping out from the edge of the clearing. The trees moved, branches twisting and stretching like skeletal fingers reaching out, ready to ensnare them. "You think you're free?" A voice hissed from the shadows, more sinister than before, and just when they thought they'd escaped, that bone-chilling sound rippled through the clearing, tinged with malice and cold mockery. Mia turned to Jack, dread pooling in her stomach, a grim realization that their battle was far from over. "What now?" she whispered, gripping his hand tightly, as they faced the emerging threat, the oppressive darkness creeping back, ready to drag them under once again. Mia's heart raced as the chilling voice wrapped around them like a noose. The shadows thickened, and the air grew frigid, curling around her throat like icy fingers. She looked toward the trees, whose branches twisted ever closer, warped and twisting, as if intent on ensnaring them in its grasp. Jack's grip on her hand tightened, but she could feel the tremor running through his fingers, an electric panic that mirrored her own. "What is that?" Jack whispered, a tremor in his voice. His wide eyes flicked toward the darkening woods, where the shadows pulsed and shifted. "It feels alive." Just then, a low growl rolled through the clearing, deeper than the earth itself. It reverberated in her bones, sending a wave of primal fear coursing through her veins. This was no mere shadow, it was something much worse. She felt it twitching, shifting just beyond the light, hungry and waiting, its breath hot against the back of her neck. Mia could almost hear the promise of pain, the lure of despair it whispered with every beat of her racing heart. Now, the voice cooed again, dripping with malice. Each syllable slithered into her ears, crawling under her skin. "You think you can just walk away after what you've done? After how you abandoned them?" Mia swallowed hard, the truth of those words sinking like stones in her stomach. She forced herself to step forward, but the shadows surged forward, forming jagged shapes that danced around them, mocking her. "Face it, you cannot escape what you are," they howled, their voices scratching at her mind. "Step back," Jack shouted, but before she could move, the forest erupted in a cacophony of sound, branches snapping and twisting. Dark, serpentine shapes began to emerge, writhing like living shadows, each one a grotesque caricature of what she had tried to forget. Faces flickered in the dark, her mother's face twisted with anguish, her brother silently screaming, mouths forming phrases she couldn't bear to hear. What she'd buried for so long now clawed back into the light, with icy claws trying to reclaim her. "Leave us alone!" Mia yelled, desperation threading through her voice. She staggered back, only to collide with something solid, and when she turned, it was as if a nightmare had come to life. A figure loomed just at the edge of the tree line, its features shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the ghostly light from the altar. It was tall and twisted, limbs bent at odd angles, a mockery of humanity that made her blood run cold. "Do you remember me?" it croaked, its voice a rasping whisper. The shadows stirred and shifted, revealing sunken eyes filled with a chilling clarity, pinning her in place. She knew that face, once vibrant and warm, now a grotesque mimicry, cracked lips stretching into a smile that sent shivers down her spine. "You left me behind." The fog rolled in again, thickening around them as the shadows converged, tightening like a vice. Her hands trembled, and for a brief moment, Mia felt something cold and clammy wrap around her ankle, pulling her towards the darkness beneath. She wanted to scream, but found her voice stuck in her throat, a quivering whisper barely escaping. "What do you want from us?" "I want you to know," the shadow thing hissed, "to remember every moment, every regret and sorrow you've cast aside. You are part of us now." The wind stirred, cool against her flushed skin, swirling the fog into grotesque shapes that coiled and prepared to dart toward her. With each word, the world around them darkened, a chasm of despair that threatened to swallow her whole. "We are not finished with you," echoed the chorus of shadows, their voices merging into one resonant sound, a chant that seeped into her mind and clutched at her sanity. You must pay a price for your freedom. Jack, we have to go. She twirled around to grab his hand, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. He was staring at the shadows, frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. We can't just leave them, he protested, voice quaking as shadows clawed at him, the darkness growing closer, tangible and dreadfully hungry. Are you out of your mind? We can't save them, she screamed, fear lending urgency to her words. They're not here anymore. But the shadows pressed in, their whispering rising, clawing at the edges of their sanity. You are never free, they hissed, swirling faster as if excited by the chaos, feeding off their fear and doubt. Suddenly, the ground underneath them began to tremble violently, roots breaking through the soil, creeping like spider legs towards them. The trees contorted, their bark darkening as if blood had soaked into the wood. You have awakened what lies beneath, the dark figure taunted, its voice a terrifying melody that twisted through the air. The earth split with a spine-chilling crack. Mia stumbled back, barely catching herself as fissures opened around the altar, shadows glancing up like hungry wolves, prepared to devour everything in their path. No, she cried out, panic surging through her veins. If they didn't escape now, they would be consumed by the darkness. Just as she stepped back, she felt something grab her wrist, and without thinking, she yanked free, fear igniting her blood. Follow me, Jack roared, pulling her toward the forest's edge. We have to run. But even as they turned to flee, shadows lunged forward, chasing them, dark fingers reaching out in desperation, clawing greedily at their legs. Mia's breath came in sharp bursts as they sprinted deeper into the woods, the path winding, turning into a suffocating labyrinth of twisting branches and overgrown thorns. Keep going, she urged, adrenaline coursing through her, driving them onward. They burst through the dense underbrush, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, echoing their fears in 1,000 disembodied voices. You will never escape us, it wailed, echoing through the trees, losing itself in the night as the shadows chased, relentless and hungry. Suddenly, Mia stumbled into a clearing, one she didn't recognize, an ancient grove that pulsated with a strange energy. The moon hung heavily overhead, casting sharp beams of light that cut through the darkness. But even here, she could feel the shadows creeping at the edges, whispering promises of despair and regret. Panting, Jack turned to her, desperation painted across his features. What do we do? They're everywhere. But even as he spoke, shadows slithered up behind him, reaching for his shoulder as he spun in panic, eyes darting. Get away! Mia shouted, lunging forward, grabbing Jack's arm just in time. They moved back, breathing hard, looking for a way out of the clearing, but every path felt suffocating, every option riddled with the darkness surrounding them. Then, without warning, the shadows surged forward, twisting and spiraling, as if summoned by an unseen force. The air thickened with their cries, a chaotic chorus that drummed against her skull. The dark figure from before stepped forward into the moonlight, its twisted smile widening grotesquely, limbs swaying as if dancing to some haunting tune. You see now what you left behind, Mia, it crooned, voice smooth yet jagged, a knife gliding over bone. You can't run from it. Embrace it, and maybe, just maybe, you will find peace. Mia felt a shiver run down her spine, a cold fear mixing with an insidious tug of curiosity that beckoned her toward the shadows. She could almost hear the faint sound of laughter mingled with the whispers, like a siren's call promising understanding. Yet she knew it led only to despair. Look closer, the figure urged, weaving in and out of the moonlit shadows that shivered around them. Find the truth buried deep within. Can you feel it? And as the fog began to settle thicker around them, the insidious nature of the shadows pressed in closer. She felt drawn, not just to the horror of their past, but to the terrible weight of their shared suffering. The earth quaked beneath them, roots snaking up toward the surface, clamoring for recognition, desperate to be set free. No, Jack shouted, stepping fiercely between Mia and the darkness. We're not listening to you, but the shadows seemed to pounce, swarming around them faster than they could react. Voices rising in an unsettling crescendo that penetrated the very core of their being. "Embrace your fears. Join us," they screamed, the atmosphere electric with pulsing energy, shifting in colors of deep violet and agonizing black. And just as the shadows threatened to envelop them completely, Mia caught sight of something flickering in the corner of her eye, almost like a glimmer of hope, a pale light fighting against the encroaching darkness. "Jack, look!" She pointed to the light, feeling a flicker of hope bloom within her. The shadows recoiled, hissing angrily, trying to pull them back into the abyss. But this was their chance. With determination surging through her, Mia grasped Jack's hand tightly once more as they both took a step toward that glimmer, their hearts pounding in tandem against the night's pulse. The moment they began to break free of the encroaching shadows, the growling whispers intensified into a deafening roar, as if the very darkness itself was trying to drag them back. But they pushed onward together, feeling that shimmering light beckoning them, fighting through the fear that clawed at their fraying sanity. And as they neared the light, a scream erupted from the shadows, echoing through the grove. The darkness writhed and twisted, furious at their defiance, its hunger unquenchable, desperate to reclaim them. "Don't stop," Jack urged, breathing hard as he pulled Mia closer. They could feel the oppressive weight of the shadows bearing down upon them, could hear the voices swelling in a frenzied pitch, crying out in rage, but still, the light grew stronger ahead. "Just a little further," she gasped, determination igniting within her. The light pulsed, warming her skin, drawing her forward through the chaos, gathering strength with each step they took. "Come back!" The dark figure's voice shrieked, twisting with anguish, clawing at the air as they broke free from the shadow's grasp, sprinting towards safety, driven by that spark of hope. As they reached the light, the shadows retreated, shrieking in fury, their angry faces melting into the void, fading into distant echoes that hauntingly lingered in the air. They blinked against the brightness, and as Mia looked over her shoulder, she saw the shadows coiling back, slinking away, leaving nothing but the weight of her memories behind. Breathing heavily, heart racing, she turned back to the light, realizing they had escaped. But at what cost? The darkness had receded, but she knew it would not stay away forever. There remained a heavy silence in the air, a promise of what lay ahead, as they stood in the ethereal glow, still feeling the lingering touch of despair. But now they were together, their burdens shared, and as they faced the uncertainty ahead, the shadows were still creeping, waiting, lurking just beyond the edges of their vision. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together," Jack vowed, squeezing her hand with fierce determination, but both of them knew deep down that the shadows would return. The battle was far from over. The war of light versus dark began and ended with their acceptance of the past, a struggle that would test them not just against the darkness outside, but against the shadows that loomed deep within their own hearts. Mia nodded, swallowing the dread rising in her throat, the echoes of the past whispering still, familiar yet terrifying. They took a cautious step forward into the light, knowing they couldn't turn back, knowing they had only begun to fight. And though the road ahead promised to be fraught with danger, one thing was clear. They would find a way to hold on, one heartbeat at a time. But the shadows laughed in their wake, ready to unearth the sins of the past and force them to face the truths they had long buried, clawing at the fabric of their courage with each precarious step. "Things are not yet as they seem," a voice echoed through the grove, unsettling and mocking, an impenetrable darkness still looming around every corner. The forest whispered their names, and the air grew thick with dread, promising that their journey was just beginning. They were forever intertwined with the shadows, a new dawn rising on the horizon, but it brought no relief. Only the chilling promise of a fight still to come. The only sound breaking the stillness was the rustling of leaves, a mournful whisper that seemed to echo their heartbeat. The shadows slinked behind the trees, curling around the trunks like smoke, a silent threat weaving in and out of existence just out of sight. Moments stretched into an eternity as they moved deeper into the magnificent yet haunting grove, where time felt warped and distorted. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on Mia's arms stand on end. With each step, she could feel the ground beneath her shifting, roots coiling like snakes, grasping at her ankles as if wanting to drag her back into the darkness. The wind picked up, a cold breath that slid through the branches above, whispering secrets that made her shiver. She turned to Jack, but his face was pale, eyes darting nervously, as if he could sense the shadows creeping closer, eager to reclaim their lost prey. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, voice strained, a tremor underscoring his words. Mia strained to listen, heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, all she could hear was the rustle of leaves, but then a soft, almost melodic sound began to filter through the trees. It was a faint, eerie giggle, high-pitched and childlike, threading its way into her mind with an unsettling familiarity. "Maybe it's just the wind," she replied, though her voice felt hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself. But the laughter echoed again, closer now, mingling with the shadows that shifted ominously around them. It was a sound that hooked into her gut, twisting like a knife. Jack grabbed her arm, eyes wide, and for a brief second, she could see the fear etched on his face. "Let's just keep moving," he said urgently, his voice barely above a whisper. As they pressed on, vines trailed through the underbrush, curling and twisting, almost reaching for them in a lazy dance. They moved through a clearing, where the moonlight revealed the remnants of what looked like an old gathering place. The bones of ancient rituals lay spread out around them, remnants of offerings long forgotten. Faded symbols were carved into the stone circle at the center, barely visible, but pulsating with a dark energy, as if they were alive, watching, waiting. Mia felt sick as cold dread settled in her stomach. She could almost hear a heartbeat in the ground, a rhythmic thumping that resonated with the whispers in the shadows. And then, without warning, the clearing grew cold, a sharp bite of air that made her breath fog. The trees around them twisted and groaned, their trunks bending as if bowing to an unseen force. She could feel the presence of something ancient and terrible lingering in the dark, a weight of despair pressing down upon them. "Mia," Jack whispered, breaking the silence, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." Before she could answer, the temperature dropped significantly, and the shadows pooled in front of them like thick black smoke. A figure emerged, half obscured by the darkness, its form shifting and twisted. Its face was indiscernible, masked by an unsettling grin that stretched too wide, distorting its features into a grotesque reflection of humanity. "Welcome," it rasped, voice like crushed glass against skin, slithering through the air. "Welcome to our sanctuary." Mia's blood ran cold as the words wrapped around her mind, filling her with an unbearable chill, pressing against her thoughts. She glanced at Jack, who looked paralyzed, horror dawning in his eyes. The figure stepped forward, the laughter echoing again, a chorus of giggles joining in, surrounding them like a sinister melody. Before they could react, shadows surged forward like a wave, encasing them within a murky vortex, the laughter intensifying. "Join us," they taunted, voices slithering into her skin. "Embrace your fears, become one with us." Mia closed her eyes against the onslaught, the darkness pressing against her. She could feel the energy swirling around them, trying to pull her under, drowning her in despair. But then came a flash of warmth, a flicker of the light they had seen before, a beacon igniting somewhere deep within her. The urge to flee surged anew, and she snapped her eyes open, refusing to succumb. "Jack!" she cried out, pulling him closer, forcing him to focus on her. "We have to fight." Just as those words escaped her lips, the shadows recoiled, hissing angrily, the figure hesitating as if momentarily wounded. They cast shifting glances at one another, confusion mingled with rage, lingering in the air like a poisonous fog. With a frantic beat of her heart, Mia grabbed Jack's hand, squeezing it as if her life depended on it. and together they began to back away from the pulsing darkness. "Run!" she shouted, adrenaline surging once again, surging through her veins. They turned, racing back into the tangled forest, shadows snapping at their heels, their laughter morphing into a cacophony that threatened to drown out their thoughts. Branches clawed at them as they bolted, roots snaring at their ankles, trying to pull them back. The shadows watched from the periphery, their intentions malignant as they lurked, waiting to ensnare the weary travelers at their most desperate moment. Mia's breath came in sharp gasps as they navigated through the maze of trees, a blind panic driving her forward. She could hear Jack behind her, his footsteps heavy, echoing through the dark. "Don't look back," he shouted, and she dared not, but fear clawed at her thoughts. What if they weren't alone? Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath Jack's feet, and he stumbled, arms flailing as he fell into a shallow pit hidden by overgrown weeds. "Jack!" Mia cried, panic ripping through her. She skidded to a halt, heart racing as she rushed to his side, extending her hand to help him up. But the moment her hand grasped his, the shadows surged forward, snaking around her ankles, pulling her down into the pit. "No, not like this," she screamed, desperately trying to pull free. The shadows enveloped them, their grasp cold and unyielding, wrapping tighter as she felt Jack being jerked down beside her, his terrified eyes locked onto hers. "Hold on," she urged, adrenaline coursing through her body. With every ounce of strength, she pulled, refusing to let the darkness swallow them whole. But the more she struggled, the more the shadows clung to them, wrapping around their throats, tightening like a noose. Mia could feel the darkness pressing in all around, echoing their worst fears, dragging them down into a pool of despair. "We're not going to let them take us," she howled, though her voice felt small against the tumult of dread that shattered through her. Jack gritted his teeth, determination flashing in his eyes as he planted his feet against the slippery walls of the pit. "On three," he yelled. "Ready?" With one last glance at the encroaching shadows, Mia nodded fiercely, feeling the power of their shared resolve. 1, 2, 3. They pushed off the sides together, frantically clawing their way back up, shadows screeching in protest as they broke free, rejoining the night air above. Breathless, they collapsed on the grass, adrenaline still surging through their veins. But before they could catch their breath, an unsettling silence settled around them, thicker than the darkness they had escaped. Sitting on the edge of the pit, they exchanged nervous glances, hearts pounding as the shadows retreated into the trees, shapes ebbing and snapping like ghosts fleeing from the light. "Did we lose them?" Jack whispered, incredulity etched into his features. Mia shook her head, scanning the darkness, aware that the weight of the night still pressed against them, sensing it was only a matter of time before the shadows returned. But then, the quiet was shattered by a high-pitched screech. The tree branches shivered, and an oppressive dread filled the air, thickening the shadows all around them. They were not alone. A powerful presence loomed over them, dark and unfathomable, ready to take root in the fear, eager to consume. "Run!" Mia shouted once more, and they sprang into action. But deep in her mind, a voice whispered, reminding her that the true battle lay ahead, a twisted game that would test not just their bodies, but their will to resist the maddening pull of the darkness that dwelled within. The shadows danced in the moonlight, mocking their every move, and as Mia ran with Jack through the night, she understood that the true horror was not merely the shadows chasing them, but the terror of what they might find within themselves when the darkness fell. As they raced deeper into the woods, with their hearts pounding in breathless anticipation of what awaited them, Mia felt something stir beneath the surface, an insatiable curiosity mixed with dread, a reminder that they were not alone, that they were forever intertwined with the unknown, and whatever emerged from it would seek to claim them once and for all. As they pushed forward, the trees closed in around them like prison bars, branches twisting and contorting, grabbing at them with gnarled fingers. A heavy mist clung low to the ground, swirling around their feet, almost alive, as if trying to snatch them back into the depths of the forest. Mia could hear the chatter again, whispering her name, a chorus of voices that danced on the edge of her sanity. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to look back, but each step felt laden with invisible weight, a reminder that the shadows were still hunting them. Jack stumbled behind her, breath sharp and frantic, the sounds of their flight a cacophony of fear that echoed into the void. A sudden chill slithered through the air, colder than anything she had ever felt, paralyzing her for a moment. The giggling grew louder, pressing against her eardrums, an irresistible taunt, echoing through the stillness of the night. Then, from the fog, a figure emerged, just a glimpse, pale skin, eyes devoid of life, limbs too long and exaggerated, twisting at impossible angles. It moved with fluid grace, too fast, and for a split second, Mia thought it smiled at her, staring straight into her soul. "Did you see that?" she gasped, wheeling around to Jack, but he was already looking past her, eyes wide, face pale as the moonlight illuminated his features. "It's not far behind," he whispered, voice trembling. The shadows crammed against them, a writhing mass hungry for warmth, for fear, for them. With renewed fear coursing through her, Mia clenched Jack's hand tighter, tugging him deeper into the labyrinth of trees. The air felt thick with something rotten, carrying the sharp stench of decay that made her stomach churn. Each breath filled her lungs with dread, weighing her down, threatening to pull her into the darkness that swirled around them. They stumbled into a small clearing, the ground soft and damp beneath their feet, the shadows shifting mysteriously at the edge. In the center lay stones, old and weathered, etched with faded runes that pulsed faintly. An altar of sorts, overgrown with moss and creeping vines. It looked out of place, a remnant of something dark and forgotten, beckoning them closer with an almost seductive pull. "What is this?" Jack whispered as they circled the stones, an unsettling unease settling like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Mia reached out, fingers brushing against the cold surface of one stone, and the moment she did, a low rumble echoed from within the earth, sending ripples through the clearing. The ground trembled beneath them, and the shadows recoiled momentarily, as if anticipating something horrible. "Run!" she yelled, pulling Jack away just as the earth split open, jagged cracks yawning wide, revealing a dark pit that seemed to swallow the light around it. The atmosphere grew thick with whispers now, all around them, an insatiable hunger that clawed at her mind, begging them to stay, to lose themselves in the shadows. They sprinted back into the trees, branches scratching at their skin as they moved, desperate to escape whatever horrific magic lingered in that dreadful place. Then came the laughter again, so close it was like the very essence of the night itself. Mia could feel it wrapping around her, tugging at her thoughts, trying to envelop her senses completely. She could hear echoes of children's voices, calling her, teasing her with familiar phrases that twisted into something grotesque. "Join us, play with us," it sang, the tone sweet yet laced with something sinister, growing louder like the thumping of a drum, each beat a reminder of their impending doom. Then, they heard it, a childlike figure stepped out from behind the trees. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, hair matted and dirty, face smeared with mud. It lifted its head slowly, revealing eyes like endless voids, black, soulless, filled with malice. "No," Jack breathed, fear choking his words as he grabbed Mia's arm, trying to pull her back, but the child grinned wide, a smile that cracked its face like a doll's that had fallen too far. "Come play with us," it called, voice sweet as sugar, yet filled with knives. Mia's heart raced, terror flooding her veins as she looked into its abyssal eyes. "We can't," she croaked, trying to reason with it, but the very air felt heavy, pushing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't bear. Darkness coiled around the child like a cloak, and it lunged toward them, effortlessly bridging the distance. Suddenly, the world dimmed, the trees losing their shapes, blending into a wall of blackness, all light extinguished as if they were wading through a thick fog. She felt Jack's grip tighten painfully. Then he screamed. The child had grabbed him, its grip like ice, pulling him back into the shadows. "Jack!" She screamed, lunging forward, but the air thickened, becoming almost viscous, making each step feel like wading through molasses. Desperation bubbled inside her. She could barely see as the shadows twisted around him, engulfing his form, laughter ringing out like broken bells. "Help me!" he cried, panic blending with horror, eyes darting back toward her as he disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Mia stumbled backward, feeling the weight of dread slam into her like an avalanche, suffocating her will to fight. The child stood before her, its face shifting into something far more sinister, a deep, unsettling chuckle vibrating through the air. "Your turn now," it sang, and as it reached for her, the void seemed to ripple, echoing the laughter of countless others hidden within. She spun on her heel, instinct kicking in, adrenaline pumping her legs faster than she thought possible. The forest narrowed around her, swirling with an unseen presence, but she didn't dare look back. The giggling morphed into whispers, growing louder, mingling with the pounding in her ears. But just when she thought she could hear nothing else, another sound emerged from the darkness, a low growling, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees, vibrating her bones. It wasn't the shadows she needed to fear anymore. It was whatever lay just beyond them, lurking, waiting, ready to pounce. With every step, every heart-thudding breath, she could almost feel it trailing her, a coldness creeping into her skin, gnawing at her resolve. She was no longer just running from darkness. She was running for her life, deeper into the unknown, where the line between reality and terror blurred, and every shadow held a promise of horror yet to come. The feeling of being watched wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud, and with each rapid breath, it became clear the nightmare was just beginning. Mia sprinted through the suffocating void, gasping for air that felt thick and stale, like it was laced with the very shadows she was escaping. The forest pressed in on her, twisting shapes looming and threatening to consume her whole. Whispers curled around her, seductive yet chilling, promising freedom if she just surrendered. But she pushed harder, fueled by desperation and the haunting echo of Jack's voice, still crying out for her somewhere in the darkness. As she dashed forward, the ground beneath her feet began to shift. The roots of ancient trees buckled and rose like serpents, tripping her and forcing her to stumble. Each time she fell, the shadows slithered closer, brushing against her with icy fingers that sent shivers up her spine. Scrambling to her feet, Mia felt the humidity of the mist mingle with her sweat, each droplet glistening like an omen in the pallid moonlight. It all felt like a cruel game, the forest playing with her sanity, but she couldn't afford to lose. Suddenly, she saw a flicker of movement ahead, a pale light cutting through the darkness. It flickered like a candle, beckoning her with an almost ethereal glow. Mia stumbled toward it, heart racing with a mix of hope and trepidation. "Jack!" she shouted again, half hoping he'd answer from some hidden refuge nearby. Instead, the light grew brighter, casting long shadows that twisted and contorted, echoing the figure of the child from earlier, now swelling in the edges of her vision. But there was something else there in that light, a grotesque shimmer that seemed to pull at her very soul. The shadows extended from the light, fingertips of darkness reaching out like hungry mouths. It gnawed at her fear, amplifying the echo of her own heartbeat. She hesitated, uncertainty binding her to the spot as the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping into a jarring cacophony. "Join us, Mia." Mia shook her head violently, forcing herself to look away, but the pull was palpable. The light flickered out, leaving her in impenetrable darkness. Then, silence. Fear surged within her, a primal instinct commanding her to retreat. In that breathless moment of stillness, she felt the presence again, a shiver creeping up her spine as if the very forest held its breath. And then, the shrill scream pierced the air, slicing through the quiet like glass. It was Jack, twisted with pain and terror, a sound that ripped any remaining hope from her chest. It echoed, reverberating around her as she clutched her hands to her ears, tears blurring her vision. "Jack!" She screamed, her voice barely a whisper against the raw terror that threatened to engulf her. And then she saw it, a shadow emerging from the darkness, gliding just beyond the perimeter of the clearing. It was a figure, grotesque and otherworldly, its limbs long and impossibly frail, as if it were a marionette in the hands of a cruel puppeteer. The shambling movement was both captivating and repellent, as if every step was a torment unto itself. The creature paused, its skeletal frame outlined by the fleeting light of her fading resolve. Mia could feel its gaze piercing through the veil of darkness, searching for her, hunting her like prey. It wore the face of the child, stretched and twisted into a sick parody of innocence, a sharp promise of pain lurking just beneath its feigned smile. As it drew closer, Mia's instinct screamed at her to run. She felt her heart pounding, a drum demanding flight. But her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot with a terror she never knew existed. The thing reached out a thin, bony finger, beckoning her closer, whispering sweet promises of release. "Join us," it echoed, its voice a haunting melody that wrapped around her like a vine. With a sudden clarity, she understood. The childlike laughter, the twisted shadows, they were all part of the same horrific scheme. They wanted her to become one with the darkness, to lose herself, just like Jack. Fury ignited in her chest. No, she wouldn't become another tale woven into the forest history. Driving deep into her core, she tore herself from the grip of the creeping shadows, dashing away from the light and toward the faintest glimmer of the moon peeking through the canopy. Each step in the opposite direction felt like rebelling against an invisible force. She could almost feel their frustration, an angry roar that rolled through the trees as she broke free from their grasp. But it was not over. As she turned to flee, the trees splintered and twisted, their branches crashing around her like the gnarled hands of the forest reaching out to claim what was already theirs. Mia ran with everything she had, tears streaming as she felt the presence behind her swell, the creature's distorted laughter echoing in a haunting symphony. Finally, she burst into a clearing, and with a gasp, her eyes widened as she found herself standing at the edge of a familiar hill that loomed above the forest, a hill she thought she'd left behind for good. Panic surged through her as she spun around, the shadows gathering behind her, their whispers growing louder, more frenzied, hungry for her submission. But she had lost too much, had faced too many horrors. In that moment, she realized that fear can't hold her captive any longer. Gathering every ounce of strength, she tore off the necklace dangling around her neck, the one that linked her soul to Jack, to the darkness lingering in the shadows. It clattered to the ground, a final severance, the last thread pulling her into their clutches. "Leave me," she shouted, voice hoarse, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Waves of darkness recoiled at her command, the whispers faltering as the shadows flickered, hesitating for just a moment. Her heart thundered in her chest as she turned once more toward the narrow path leading away from that hell. This was her chance. She sprinted down the hill, feeling the fiery resolve ignite within her. The air thinned as she raced towards freedom, the anguish of losing Jack weighing heavy on her heart, but pushing her ever onward. Each step took her further from the lethal whispers, their claws grasping at her retreating figure. But she didn't look back. Not once. The forest behind her erupted in an angry roar, the shadows swirling as if enraged by her escape. The darkness crackled with fury, but it was too late. She had found her way out. She stumbled into the night air, the moon bathing her in its cool light. But as she stood alone, breathing heavily, trembling in the silence that had overtaken the forest, a haunting thought curled at the edges of her mind like smoke. Did you really escape? The laughter, that sweet yet sinister laughter, echoed in her thoughts, and she felt a chill settle over her. The grip of the darkness may have loosened, but the sinister grip of the forest was a stain that might never wash away. As she looked back one last time, she could have sworn she saw those familiar shadows lingering, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting soul, whispering sweet promises. Their game would continue. And in that moment, Mia knew the forest was more than just a mere shadow, a haunting reminder of what she had lost. It was alive. It remembered. It waited. With a gasp that echoed out into the stillness, she turned and walked away. The path ahead still shrouded in uncertainty, but she was free. For now.